Hey guys, tonight we're burrowing into the long, dark, brutally cold heart of the Viking winter, into smoke-thick halls with no chimneys, walls built from stacked turf a full metre thick, and a single fire pit that somehow, against all logic, kept entire households alive through months of Arctic dark. We'll talk about the thrall whose whole job was keeping embers glowing until dawn, about a hall in Iceland buried whole by a volcano in the year 1104, about an army of thousands wintering in enemy territory with nothing but turf walls between them and a Mercian king's soldiers, and about a myth so cold it imagined a winter that lasted 3 years without a single day of summer in between. Welcome to the world before central heating, before insulation as we know it, before anyone had the first clue what a thermostat might be. You're warm right now, wherever you're lying. That won't be true where we're going. So dim the lights, and if you'd like, let a fan hum low in the background. Something like wind finding its way through a smoke hole in a turf roof, somewhere above the Arctic Circle, 13 centuries ago. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You smell it before you see anything. Wood smoke, yes, but underneath it something sharper, wet wool steaming as it dries, tallow, the animal warmth of many bodies packed into one room, and beneath all of that, faint and constant, the sweet rot of packed earth that never quite finishes drying out. Your eyes are still adjusting from the blue-white glare of a Norwegian December afternoon, and for a moment the longhouse in front of you is just a wall of dark, broken by one long orange smear of firelight running down its centre. Then shapes resolve, benches lining both walls. A dog stretched near the warmth, a dozen half-turned faces. You've just stepped in out of one of the harsher environments on this earth, and you're bracing for the room to be only marginally better than outside. It isn't. Within minutes you'll have stopped shivering entirely, and you won't fully understand why until someone explains the whole building to you, piece by piece, the way you're about to have it explained to you now. Here's the thing about the word fireplace. It implies a hearth built into a wall, with a flue drawing smoke straight up through a chimney and out into open sky. This building has none of that, and neither did any ordinary Viking Age hall from Trindelag to the Faroes. What it has instead is a langolder, literally a long fire, a shallow trench of packed clay and stone running down the centre of the main room, sometimes stretching 10 or 15 feet, fed with wood, peat or dried dung, depending on what the local landscape could spare. A typical longhouse of this era might run 20 to 30 metres end to end, and only 5 or 6 metres wide, one continuous room, or occasionally two, with this fire as its only heat source for the entire structure. There is no chimney, because a chimney would be a hole punched straight through a roof that has been built, deliberately, to do the opposite of let heat escape. The only opening is a single hole near the roof's peak, barely large enough to fit 2 fists through, called a jury, and that hole is the entire ventilation system for a room that tonight will sleep upward of 20 people. You would reasonably expect to choke. For the first few minutes your eyes do sting and your throat does catch, and you find yourself glancing toward the door, calculating how rude it would be to step back outside for air. But watch what the room's actual occupants do, and you'll notice nobody else is coughing. Down at bench height, where people sit and eat and will eventually sleep, the air is close to clear. Smoke rises the way smoke always rises, and what forms above head height is a thick, slow churning layer of haze that simply sits there, banked against the underside of the turf roof, drifting toward the loggia the way water eventually finds a drain. Stand up too quickly near the walls, though, and you'll understand immediately why every adult in this room moves in a slight, practiced stoop the moment they leave the bench. That blackened ceiling isn't neglect. Archaeologists who've examined surviving roof timbers from Norse period buildings have found soot layers built up in distinct, dense bands, sometimes close to a centimetre thick after years of continuous burning. A kind of accidental record of exactly how a fire like this was meant to behave, night after night, for a working lifetime. Congratulations, you've just learned the first rule of Viking Age architecture. The house was never trying to remove the smoke. It was only ever trying to manage it. The person doing tonight's managing is a thin, quick-moving young man named Aoun, a name you catch when the woman running the household calls it across the room, short and unbothered, the way you'd address someone whose job you never have to explain twice. Aoun is not a guest and not a son. He is a thrall, an enslaved member of this household, likely captured or born into that status, and among his standing duties, alongside hauling water, mucking the byre, and mending fishing line, is this fire, every night, for as long as anyone here can remember him doing it. He doesn't sit with the newcomers near the door. He crouches at the hearth's edge with a birch bark fan and a short iron rake, watching the flame the way you might watch milk about to boil over, constantly, almost without seeming to think about it, adjusting a log here, pulling one back there, long before the fire has actually done anything wrong. By full dark, perhaps 2 hours after you first ducked through the doorway, the temperature difference between here and the world outside has become genuinely hard to believe. Out there, in a Norwegian coastal winter, you're looking at air well below freezing, driven by a wind that makes any number on a thermometer feel like a polite suggestion rather than a fact. In here, near the long fire, the air is unmistakably warm, sweater-off warm, socks-optional warm, the kind of warm that makes a newcomer instinctively suspicious of a building with no chimney and walls made of dirt. The mechanism, once it's pointed out to you, turns out to be almost embarrassingly simple. Those walls, built from cut turf stacked in overlapping courses and often more than a metre thick in the colder reaches of the Norse world, behave like an enormous stone hot water bottle. They absorb heat all evening while the fire burns strong, and they release it back into the room for hours afterward, long after the flames themselves have dropped to a bed of quiet coals. It isn't advanced engineering, it's thermal mass, arrived at by people with no word for thermal mass and every practical reason on earth to work out how it behaved anyway. Here's what nobody thought to warn you about, though, and it announces itself with a low, unmistakable shuffle from the far end of the hall. The animals. In a considerable number of Viking Age longhouses, especially in Norway's colder inland valleys and out on wind-scoured islands like the Faroes, where excavated byre dwellings have turned up again and again in the archaeological record, one end of this very same building doubles as a barn. Not a separate structure 30 feet away. The same roof, the same walls, divided from the human living space by little more than a wooden partition or a slight change in floor level. To modern ears it sounds like a design flaw, cattle and people sharing a single room through an entire winter. It is, in practice, closer to the opposite. A single cow generates a real and useful amount of body heat over the course of a long night, and a byre holding 6 or 8 of them functions as a second furnace that costs nothing extra to run, one that also happens to produce manure that, dried, becomes fuel for tomorrow's fire when the woodpile runs short. The smell that drifts up from that end of the hall is not subtle, and by the second hour you'll have mostly stopped registering it, which tells you everything about how normal this arrangement was to the people actually living it. The room's only other light source, once full dark settles in, sits on a stone shelf near the wall, a shallow bowl carved from soapstone, filled with rendered fish or seal oil, a twist of moss or wick floating at its centre and burning with a small, steady, slightly fishy flame. It throws barely enough light to see a face by, and it adds its own small measure of heat and its own small measure of smell to a room already thick with both. Someone trims the wick without being asked, the same unconscious competence you've already seen in how Aoun tends the long fire, the whole household running on habits so deeply worn in that nobody discusses them out loud anymore. The pirate ship equivalent of a group chat nobody remembers agreeing to join, except here it's a household, and the chat has been running for generations. By what you'd guess is close to midnight, the long fire has burned down from open flame to a deep, quiet bed of orange coals. And this is where Aoun's real skill shows itself. He doesn't feed it, and he doesn't let it die either. Both would be mistakes tonight. Instead, he rakes the coals into a compact mound near the trench's centre and buries them under a careful layer of fine ash, several inches deep, patted down with the flat of the rake. It looks, if you don't know better, like he's smothering the fire on purpose. He is doing something closer to the opposite. That blanket of ash slows the burn to almost nothing, holding a core of living coal that can, with a handful of dry kindling and a few minutes of patient blowing at dawn, be coaxed back into open flame without ever striking flint and steel from scratch. A task that, on a damp morning, could easily eat the better part of an hour. There's a name for this careful nightly ritual in later folk tradition across the Norse and Gaelic world, smoring, hushing the fire, and it represents one of the oldest continuously practiced pieces of household engineering on the planet. Don't rebuild the fire from nothing every single day. Preserve it, coal by coal, the way you'd preserve anything else you couldn't easily replace. You lie down, finally, on a bench that an hour ago was where 3 people sat mending fishing line by lamplight. It's layered with straw for softness, a rougher blanket of homespun wool over that, and on top, a sheepskin with the fleece left on, thick and slightly oily to the touch. Someone hands you a second skin without being asked, because in a house like this, in a season like this, nobody sleeps under a single layer if there's a spare one within reach. The bench isn't yours alone, either within the hour. 2 more bodies settle in close beside you, shoulder to shoulder, and nobody apologises for the closeness and nobody expects them to. Shared warmth here isn't an imposition, it's the actual plan. The same plan that's been keeping this household alive every winter for longer than anyone in the room can remember being told about. You start to wonder, lying there, why anyone built with turf and packed earth in the first place instead of the timber this culture is famous for. The answer, as it turns out, is exhaustion, not of people, of land. The earliest Norse settlers who arrived in places like Iceland in the last decades of the 9th century found forests of birch and willow scattered across roughly a quarter of the island, by some estimates of the pollen record, and within a couple of generations of clearing that land for farms, fuel and shipbuilding, most of it was simply gone. What replaced timber as the default building material wasn't a stylistic choice. It was turf, cut in thick rectangular blocks and stacked in overlapping courses like enormous bricks, sometimes with a rubble core of stone packed between 2 turf skins for extra strength and thickness. A well-built turf wall in Iceland or the more exposed parts of Norway could run well over a metre thick at the base, tapering slightly as it rose, walls so substantial that a grown man could, in places, comfortably sit in the width of a window recess cut through one. Timber didn't disappear from these buildings entirely. A skeleton of wooden posts and roof beams still carried the structural load. Timber that was in some regions imported at real expense, sometimes from as far away as Norway itself, once Iceland's own supply thinned out. But the walls, the insulation, the actual thing standing between you and the cold, that was earth, stacked by hand, 1 course at a time. Aoun's status is worth sitting with a moment longer, because it shapes everything about how this household actually runs. Thraldom in the Viking Age wasn't a metaphor and it wasn't gentle. It meant Aoun could be bought, sold or inherited like any other piece of property. And Icelandic and Norwegian law codes recorded from the centuries just after this period treat enslaved people as assets with a fixed value. Not as members of the family in any legal sense. And yet the same law codes, along with saga tradition, also describe paths out of that status, manumission, the freeing of a thrall by a master, sometimes as a reward for long and trusted service, sometimes purchased by the thrall's own labour over years. Whether Aoun will ever see that day, nobody in this hall is telling you tonight. What you can see, watching him work the fire with the same unhurried competence hour after hour, is that his labour is not incidental to this household's survival. It's central to it. Take away the person who reliably keeps the coals alive until morning, and you don't just lose convenience. In the coldest weeks of a bad winter, you potentially lose the whole household's margin for error. That margin, it turns out, is thinner than the warmth of this room might suggest. Later Icelandic annals terse year-by-year records kept by monasteries and later scholars some of it compiled well after the events described, note winters harsh enough that livestock starved in their pens and, in the grimmest entries, that people were found frozen who'd been caught outside in a sudden storm. A fate the sagas and later folk memory treat as a real and specific danger rather than a vague generic hardship. Inside a longhouse, the greatest risk isn't usually the cold itself, it's dampness. Turf walls, for all their insulating power, sweat condensation when warm interior air meets cold earth, and a badly maintained roof lets meltwater seep through the sod in a thaw, soaking the layer of birch bark or straw that's typically packed beneath the turf to keep the interior dry. A roof heavy with wet snow, meanwhile, is its own hazard entirely. A sudden thaw followed by refreezing could add enough dead weight to strain roof timbers that had already stood for a generation or two, and a partial collapse, while not an everyday event, was a real enough possibility that houses were checked and reinforced before the heaviest snows arrived, not after. There are no windows in any meaningful sense to tell you when morning comes, no glass certainly, and precious little of the thin, translucent membrane some wealthier households stretched over a small opening to let in a diffuse grey light. Instead, dawn announces itself the way it always has in a house like this, sound before light, the rooster, if the household keeps one, going off somewhere near the byre end. The specific creak of the outer door as someone, likely Aoun again, already awake before anyone asked him to be, steps out to judge the weather and the depth of new snow against the doorframe. The shift in the animal's restlessness, cattle that have learned, the same as any farm animal anywhere, roughly what hour brings feeding. You realise, listening to it, that this household doesn't need a window to know the time. It has spent generations building a clock out of habit, animal behaviour, and one very reliable young man with a rake, and by every measure that's actually mattered here for centuries, that clock has never once needed winding. It's worth sitting, too, with the risk this whole arrangement carries, because an open fire burning 10 feet from a timber roof frame packed with dry straw insulation is not a safe bet by any modern definition, and the Norse world knew it. House burning, literally, burning someone's house down around them, sometimes with the household still inside, shows up often enough in later Icelandic saga tradition as a specific named form of vengeance that historians treat it as a recognisable feature of the period's worst feuds, whatever embellishment individual saga episodes may carry. That's murder by architecture, exploit the very thing keeping a family alive all winter, and turn it into the mechanism of their death instead. Ordinary accidental fires were a real hazard on their own. Without anyone's help, a spark carried the wrong way by a draught through the Algeri, a lamp knocked from its shelf, a pile of drying wool set too close to the long fire's edge. Which is exactly why someone like Aoun exists as a fixed, trusted role, rather than a chore rotated carelessly among whoever's free that evening. A fire tended by the same steady hands every single night, for years, is a fire whose behaviour somebody actually knows. Before you drift off, the Shfreja passes near Aoun's corner of the hearth one last time, and this time she stops. What she says is too quiet and too quick for you to catch clearly, but you catch his answer, a short laugh, unguarded, the first genuinely relaxed sound you've heard from him all evening. It's a small thing, it shouldn't mean much, but it's the kind of detail that later Icelandic lore texts hint at, without ever quite spelling out in full, that a thrall's path toward freedom, where it existed at all, often ran through exactly this kind of long, unglamorous reliability. Years of being the one person a household could count on in the dark, coal after coal, winter after winter, until trust itself became a kind of currency worth more than the silver a master might otherwise have taken for him. Whether that's the road Aoun is on, nobody in this hall says outright, and you won't get to find out tonight. But for one unguarded second, crouched by a fire he's tended 1,000 times before, he looks less like property and more like a man who knows, better than anyone else in the room, exactly how this house survives, and is quietly, privately proud of it. By the time you finally feel sleep pulling at you, the hall has gone almost entirely quiet, no more low talk from the far benches. No more clink of tools being put away, just breathing. The occasional shift of straw underneath someone's weight, and the fire's coals ticking softly as they cool toward the ash that will smother and preserve them until dawn. Tomorrow this same bench will be folded back into a seat, this same room back into a workshop and dining hall and byre-adjacent barnyard, all before the light has properly returned. Tonight, though, it's simply a place to be warm, in a season built almost entirely out of ways not to be. What happens in the deepest, coldest hour of the night, once even Oun's carefully banked coals have gone nearly still, is a different matter entirely. But that's not yet. For now you lie in the dark, listening to the slow rhythm of a dozen other people breathing, to the occasional creak of a roof beam settling under its weight of turf and snow, to something that might be wind finding the jury and might just be the fire ticking as it cools. Down at the byre end, a cow shifts against its tether. It is not, by any honest measure, comfortable, not in the way you'd define comfortable back home. But it is, unmistakably, warm, and given that a few hours ago you were standing outside in air cold enough to genuinely hurt, warm turns out to be the only standard in this story that matters tonight. Oun's hall will stand through this winter, and many more like it, its fire tended and its coals hushed to sleep every night by hands that know exactly how much ash to use. Not every hall gets that long a story. Some get exactly one more winter, and then a mountain decides the rest of the story for them. Nobody inside the farmhouse in the valley of Djurðardalur, in the interior of southern Iceland, had any warning beyond what the mountain itself gave them, and by the standards of the year 1104, that warning wasn't much. First a tremor, faint enough to rattle a hanging lamp without waking anyone who wasn't already listening for it. Then, within hours, a column of ash rising from Hekla, a volcano the settlers already regarded warily, its name eventually giving medieval Europeans, centuries later, a byword for the gates of hell itself, climbing high enough to darken a sky that, in an Icelandic summer, wasn't supposed to darken at all. We don't know the names of the people who lived in that particular farmhouse, and nothing in the honest historical record lets us invent them. What we do know, because the ground told us 7 centuries later, is what they left behind when they ran. Welcome to the story of a building type, not a single building, because to understand what was lost at that one farm, called Sting, you have to understand what an Icelandic longhouse had become by the early 12th century, several generations removed from the first turf and timber halls the earliest settlers threw up in a hurry. Iceland's settlement age, remembered in later medieval texts like the Landenmap, the Book of Settlements, is traditionally dated to beginning around 874 AD, a date preserved in saga tradition rather than a contemporary written record, worth holding a little loosely, but broadly consistent with archaeological and tephra evidence for when Norse farms first appear across the island. By Sting's time, roughly 2.5 centuries later, the basic longhouse had been refined, farm by farm, generation by generation, into something noticeably more specialised than the single smoky hall a first-wave settler might have built. Sting's main hall ran about 18 metres long, still centred on a long fire trench much like the one Oun tends, but attached to it, through short connecting passages, were separate purpose-built rooms, a dedicated byre for the livestock, set apart from human sleeping quarters rather than sharing the same open room, a small dairy space for turning milk into skyr, the tangy strained cheese like staple that kept a household fed through months when little else grew. And, strikingly, a stone-lined sunken bathing pool fed by a natural warm spring tucked just outside the main structure, a small luxury made possible only because this particular farm happened to sit near geothermal water, a resource as regionally specific to Iceland as the volcano that would eventually end it. This is the story of Stung, the farm that a volcano ended, and, in ending it, accidentally preserved. Every one of those refinements at Sting represents a small, hard-won lesson learned across generations of Icelandic winters. The separate byre wasn't an aesthetic choice. It reflects a slow realisation, worked out farm by farm across the island, that cattle sharing the exact same airspace as sleeping humans brought real costs alongside their heat, parasites, disease. The simple headache of managing manure inside a living space, costs that outweighed the benefit once a household had the resources and labour to build a properly separated stall instead. The entry passage, a narrow buffered vestibule between the outside door and the main hall, functioned as a crude airlock, a small trapped pocket of intermediate temperature air that meant every time someone came in from outside, they weren't dumping the full force of an Icelandic gale directly onto the long fire and every sleeping body near it. None of this appears all at once, fully formed, in the first Norse farms built on the island. It accumulates, the way any inherited craft accumulates, through decades of somebody noticing a problem and somebody else's grandchild finally fixing it. But Iceland in this period was also quietly running out of the thing that had made those early farms possible in the first place. The birch woodland that pollen records suggest covered somewhere around a quarter of the island at the time of settlement had, by Stinger's era, been cut, burned and grazed down to a fraction of that, cleared for fields, for fuel, for the timber frames every one of these turf buildings still needed, no matter how thick their earthen walls got. Soil erosion studies from across southern Iceland, layers of wind-blown sand interleaved with volcanic ash in the ground itself, show a landscape actively thinning under the settlers' feet within just a few generations of their arrival, the deforestation and overgrazing compounding each other in a feedback loop nobody at the time had the ecological vocabulary to fully diagnose, even as they clearly understood, in practical terms, that good timber and good grazing land were both getting harder to come by than their grandparents had known. It's an uncomfortable footnote to a story about human ingenuity, the same population solving the problem of Arctic cold with increasingly clever architecture was, at the very same time, quietly eroding the resource base that architecture depended on. The people of Sting weren't ignorant of the mountain looming over their valley, either, even if they couldn't have predicted the exact morning it would turn on them. Hekla had erupted before within the memory of Iceland's earliest generations of settlers. The geological record shows a significant eruption not long after the island's initial settlement, and Icelandic communities living in its shadow for 2 centuries would have absorbed, the way any community does, a working folk knowledge of what the mountain's rumbling moods could mean, even without modern seismology to formalise it. That reputation only grew after Sting's destruction. Within a few generations, medieval European clergymen writing far outside Iceland, a 12th century Cistercian abbot named Herbert of Clairvaux among them, and later the German monk Cesarius of Heisterbach, had begun describing Hekla in Latin texts as something close to a literal gateway to hell, a place where the damned could reportedly be heard screaming from within the mountain itself. It's a claim that says considerably more about medieval European imagination than about Icelandic geology, and it belongs filed firmly under legend rather than fact, but it's a striking measure of just how far this one valley's disaster travelled, reshaping how an entire continent pictured volcanic fire for centuries afterward. Stinger wasn't alone in the valley, and it wasn't the only household the 1104 eruption erased in a single season. Archaeologists working in Djurasöder across the 20th century have identified roughly 20 farm sites buried under the same ash layer, several of them excavated in the decades following that first 1939 expedition, each one adding another sealed cross-section of the same abandoned moment. Some were smaller and poorer than Sting, single-room halls without the luxury of a separate bathing pool or dedicated dairy. Others show signs of real prosperity, comparable to or exceeding Sting's own. Taken together, they paint a picture not of one unlucky household, but of an entire settled agricultural community. Fields, byres, boundary walls, and all erased from the map in what was, by the standards of Iceland's slow-moving farming economy, essentially a single catastrophic week. It's the kind of event that later Icelandic annalistic writing tends to compress into a single grim sentence, if it mentions the valley by name at all. The ground itself, once excavated, tells a far longer and more granular story than any surviving line of medieval prose ever bothered to record. That story includes the small, unglamorous evidence of a household that had no idea it was living through its final ordinary season. Animal bones recovered from Stingier's byre indicate a herd built around cattle and sheep, consistent with mixed farms elsewhere on the island at the time. Animals presumably driven out or lost when the ash began to fall, rather than slaughtered in some dramatic last stand. Loom weights and spindle hauls turned up scattered through the hall in numbers that suggest wool production, spinning, weaving, the raw material of both clothing and, as later Icelandic law codes make explicit, a standardized currency called vamel. Homespun cloth measured by the ell and used to pay debts, taxes and fines in a society that had comparatively little coined silver in everyday circulation was still actively underway right up until the household left. None of it is dramatic on its own. A dropped spindle haul, a stall of cattle, a fire trench with its ash undisturbed. But it's exactly that ordinariness, preserved rather than erased, that gives Sting its real weight. Not the story of a spectacular Viking Age catastrophe, but the story of an entirely unremarkable Tuesday interrupted mid-motion that happened to survive long enough for someone to eventually walk back into it. Hecla didn't care about any of that, and the eruption of 1104 arrived indifferent to how refined Sting's design had become. Tephrochronologists, scientists who date archaeological layers by matching them to known volcanic ash falls, each eruption leaving a distinct chemical and mineral signature in the soil, have identified the specific ash layer from this eruption across a wide swath of southern Iceland, and it sits, unmistakably, directly on top of the occupation floor at Sting and roughly 20 other farms scattered through the Jösurdla Valley. The ashfall wasn't the kind of fast-moving lava flow that leaves no time to run. Accounts consistent with later eruptions at the same volcano suggest a rain of fine grey ash and pumice, accumulating over hours and days rather than minutes, drifting down out of a sky gone the wrong colour for the middle of a summer's day, settling into every fold of pasture and every open water trough, quietly making the whole valley unfit for farming, without necessarily flattening a single wall. That's arguably the crueler version of the disaster, not a single violent night that ends everything at once, but hours and then days of watching the sky keep falling, knowing with each new inch of grey ash on the ground that the fields wouldn't recover this season, and increasingly that they might never recover at all. The households of Jösurdla made the only sound choice left to them. They left. They took what they could carry, herded what livestock would still move, and walked out of a valley that 250 years of accumulated craft had turned into one of the more comfortable places in Iceland to spend a winter. An entire farming community, refined generation after generation into something genuinely sophisticated, simply went quiet, not conquered, not starved out by an enemy, just outlasted by a mountain that had never once needed to negotiate. Here's the part that turns a disaster into an archaeologist's best possible stroke of luck 700 and some years later. Volcanic ash, it turns out, is an extraordinary preservative, sealing a site the moment it falls and protecting it from the two things that erase most abandoned buildings over the centuries: exposure to weather, and reuse by later generations who'd otherwise cart off the stone and timber for their own farms. When a joint Nordic archaeological expedition excavated Sting in 1939, they weren't digging through centuries of disturbed, jumbled rebuilding the way most excavated Viking Age sites require. They were opening a single sealed moment, post holes still showing where roof supports had stood, the long fire's ash bed undisturbed in its trench, the outline of that sunken bathing pool intact beside the hall, small household objects, spindle hauls for spinning wool, fragments of soapstone vessels much like the lamp bowl in Aun's hall, sitting more or less where their owners had set them down for what they must have assumed that morning was an ordinary day. Icelanders have taken to calling sites like this their own small cold-weather answer to Pompeii, and the comparison, however imperfect, isn't wrong. A disaster froze a moment of ordinary domestic life in place, in enough detail that people alive today can reconstruct, board by board, exactly how a household like this one worked. That reconstruction now exists a short distance from the original ruin, at a site called Javeldisbryn, the Commonwealth Farm, built in the 1970s as a full-scale, materially faithful rebuild of the Stung Longhouse using the excavation data as its blueprint. The same 18-metre hall, the same long fire trench, the same separated byre and dairy and bathing pool, raised from turf and timber using techniques as close to the originals as modern builders could manage. Walk through it today, and you're not looking at a guess. You're looking at an engineering answer, checked twice, once by the people who actually lived with it and refined it across generations, and once by an eruption that happened, entirely by accident, to preserve their homework so a later century could grade it. Look closely at the floor plan pulled from that 1939 excavation, and one detail in particular tells you almost everything about how much trial and error separates Sting from the first rough halls, the earliest Icelandic settlers, threw together in a hurry 2.5 centuries earlier. It's the Andari, a narrow entrance passage, sometimes barely wide enough for one person to pass through at a time, set between the outer door and the main hall rather than opening straight from outside air onto the long fire. On paper it looks like wasted space, a few extra metres of turf-walled corridor that could have simply been added to the hall itself. In practice, it functions as a buffer, a pocket of intermediate temperature air that absorbs the worst of an open door's cold blast before it ever reaches the fire, the sleeping benches, or the people nearest them. Earlier Norse halls, including many of the very first generation built in Iceland, often opened directly from the outdoors into the main room, no buffer at all. A design that worked well enough in milder Norwegian valleys many of the settlers had left behind, but proved a genuine liability against Iceland's harder gusts. Somewhere across those 250 years, without a single written treatise on architecture surviving to explain the reasoning, someone worked out that a wasted length of corridor was a fair trade for a warmer hall, and the idea spread, farm to farm, until by Sting's time it had become close to standard practice for anyone who could afford the extra timber and turf. Rebuilding all of that from scratch, 7.5 centuries after the ash fell, was not a matter of guesswork either. When the team behind Javeldisbryn set out to construct their full-scale reconstruction in the 1970s, they worked directly from the excavation's measured floor plan. The exact footprint of every wall, the precise location and depth of the long fire trench, the dimensions of the byre stalls and the sunken bath, rather than from artistic impression or a general sense of what Vikings probably had. Modern experimental archaeologists have used reconstructions built to this level of fidelity for exactly the kind of testing you'd expect, lighting real fires in a real turf-walled hall and measuring, with instruments the original builders never had, just how much heat a metre-thick earthen wall actually holds, how long it takes a long fire's coals to cool past the point of easy relighting, how the Jurai's small opening genuinely performs at pulling smoke up and out rather than letting it pool at head height. The results, again and again, confirm what Owen and every fire tender like him already knew from lived experience rather than instrumentation. It works, reliably, by a comfortable margin, against a climate that gives almost nothing away for free. What Sting leaves behind, more than any single artefact pulled from its ash, is a kind of quiet argument about how good this system actually was, right up until the moment geology overruled it. 2.5 centuries of Icelandic households, working with turf, timber they had to import or ration, and a fire trench barely different in principle from the one warming Aoun's hall, had built something that worked. Genuinely, reliably, warm in an Arctic winter worked, against a landscape that offered almost nothing in the way of forgiveness. It took a volcano, not a design flaw, to end it, and it took that same volcano, entombing the evidence in ash, rather than letting time and reuse erase it the way time erases almost everything else from this period, to let anyone centuries later actually prove it. Even the roof told its own quiet part of the story. Fragments of collapsed roofing recovered during the excavation still carried the same dense, blackened soot build-up you'd expect from generations of a long fire burning directly beneath them. The very same accumulation, in principle, already darkening the beams above Aoun's head this same winter, in a different valley, on a hall that still had years left to give. At Ston, that soot layer simply stopped being added to, on one specific and otherwise unremarkable day, and everything above and below it froze in place exactly as the household had left it. It's a strange kind of continuity to hold on to. Two households, centuries or valleys or entire lifetimes apart from each other, both trusting the exact same blackened ceiling to keep them warm. One of them getting to grow old inside that trust, the other finding out, without warning, that the mountain above their valley had never actually promised them that. Farms elsewhere in Iceland that escaped Hekla's ash entirely still faced their own version of the same volcanic gamble every single winter, whether the mountain that eventually caught them was Hekla, or one of the island's dozens of other active systems. Iceland sits directly astride the mid-Atlantic ridge, a genuinely unusual position for any inhabited landmass, and the same restless geology that gave its farms hot springs for bathing and geothermal water for the occasional luxury like Stingy's sunken pool, also meant that no farm, however carefully built, and however many generations of accumulated craft went into its walls, could ever fully insure itself against the ground itself turning hostile. Later Icelandic annals record eruptions with a kind of grim regularity across the medieval centuries that followed Sting's burial, Katla, Hekla again, and others, each one a fresh reminder that the same volcanic activity responsible for Iceland's very existence as an island could, without much warning, undo in days what generations of careful turf cutting and fire tending had spent decades building. It's a sobering footnote to hold alongside all that engineering ingenuity. The households of this period weren't just solving for cold. They were solving for cold on top of a landscape that could, on its own schedule and with no negotiation possible, simply end the conversation entirely. There's a particular kind of wonder in that trade, if you sit with it long enough. Almost nothing survives from the Viking Age the way Sting survived. No worn threshold stones polished smooth by generations of feet. No accidentally preserved wool still on its spindle. No ash bed in a fire trench left exactly as the last hand raked it. Most of what we know about how these buildings actually felt to live in comes from reconstruction, inference, and educated guesswork stitched together from scattered postholes and second-hand written description. Sting is the rare exception, a household's entire physical routine handed forward whole, not because anyone intended to leave a record, but because a mountain buried the evidence before time could get to it first. The eruption that ended one family's ordinary winter is the same event that let a much later century finally understand, in exact and physical detail, just how hard won and how successful that ordinariness really was. Not every household that mastered the Arctic winter got to stay home to do it, though. Some of the largest, most confident groups of Norse-speaking people ever assembled spent their winters not in a farm they'd built themselves, but in enemy territory, with an entire kingdom actively trying to starve them out. And that's a very different kind of cold to survive. Not every household got sentries. Not every household got even a full night without disruption. But every single one of them, rich or poor, sophisticated turf palace or single-room hut, still had to solve the same basic nightly problem Owen's household solves without a second thought. How exactly do you get an entire family safely and warmly to sleep, in a room with no bed frames as you'd picture them, and no heating beyond a fire that's already fighting for its life against the cold? Outside? You've come in from the cold yourself, wet wool clinging to your shoulders, and the first thing anyone in this house does, before food, before greetings, is get you out of that outer layer and hang it near enough to the fire to steam. You can hear it happening before you fully register the smell, a faint, constant hiss of moisture lifting off damp wool into warm air, an entire rack of cloaks and tunics along one wall exhaling the day's weather back into the room. Wet wool against skin all night isn't just uncomfortable here, it's a real and understood danger, a fast route from merely cold to genuinely hypothermic in a climate that offers no forgiveness for a bad decision made at bedtime. And every household with any sense treats drying out before sleep as close to a rule rather than a preference. Here's the thing about what you're actually going to sleep on tonight, because it is decidedly not a mattress by any definition you'd recognise. The benches that line both walls of the hall, the same ones people sat on all evening to eat and mend rope and talk, get built up before bed with a thick layer of dry material, straw where it's available, or in regions where straw is harder to come by, heather, cut and dried and packed densely enough to trap warm air the same way any good insulation traps warm air. Heather has its own particular advantage that straw doesn't quite match, a springy, resilient structure that holds its loft night after night without flattening the way straw eventually does, and a natural resistance to the kind of insect life that tends to move into anything organic and left undisturbed for months at a stretch. Over that goes a rougher underlayer of homespun wool cloth, and over that, for anyone lucky enough to have one, a sheepskin with the fleece left on, thick, faintly oily with retained lanolin, genuinely warm against skin in a way that plain wool alone struggles to match. The blankets themselves carry more economic weight than you'd guess from just looking at them, and it's worth taking a moment to actually picture the labour stacked inside a single one. That homespun wool cloth is called vammel, and in Iceland especially, it wasn't only bedding, it was money, woven by hand on an upright loom, thread by thread, across weeks of a household's winter evenings. The same evenings you've already watched pass on this very bench before it became a bed. Later Icelandic law codes, compiled and written down in the centuries after this period, but describing practices that clearly predate their writing, fix specific values for vammel by the ell, a standard unit of length, treating a bolt of properly woven cloth as functionally equivalent to a set quantity of silver for the purposes of paying debts, fines, and dowries in a society that had comparatively little actual coined money changing hands in everyday transactions. Every blanket on every bench in this hall represents real, countable hours of a woman's labour, carding, spinning and weaving were understood, both practically and legally, as central economic work, not a domestic afterthought. And a household's wealth in cloth was as real a form of wealth as its wealth in livestock or land. You're not just borrowing a blanket for the night. You're wrapped in a small, portable unit of this family's actual net worth. You'd assumed, walking in, that everyone strips down to sleep the way you might at home. They don't mostly, and the reasons are entirely practical rather than modest. Most people here sleep in some version of what they wore during the day, a linen or wool shift, an undertunic, whatever layer sits closest to skin, because getting fully undressed in a room this cold, even a room this successfully warmed, wastes body heat you'll spend the first uncomfortable hour trying to earn back. Children and the elderly, the two groups least able to regulate their own body temperature through a long, cold night, typically get the warmest spots on the bench nearest the fire and the thickest share of the household's furs, a small practical form of triage that nobody here needs explained to them, because everybody in the room has either been that child once or expects, with a little luck, to eventually be that elder. Down near the end of the bench closest to the fire, a young girl named Ra, maybe 7 or 8, is already tucked in beside an older woman you'd guess is her grandmother, the two of them sharing one large sheepskin between them, Ra's back pressed against the older woman's chest. It's not sentiment alone arranging them that way, though there's clearly some of that too. It's the same logic driving every sleeping arrangement in this hall. Two bodies share heat more efficiently than one, and pairing the household's smallest member with one of its most experienced hands means someone is awake enough, even half asleep, to notice if a small child's blanket has slipped or her feet have gone cold. You watch the grandmother murmur something too quiet to catch, and Ra answers with a small, sleepy laugh, and it's the kind of unremarkable tenderness that never once needed a written record to happen. It just happened, the same way, on this same bench, most nights of most winters, for as long as this particular pairing of grandmother and granddaughter had shared it. By the time the whole hall has properly settled, dreams themselves carry a weight here that you might not expect. Norse tradition, preserved in later medieval Icelandic sagas, and in poems collected in what's now called the Poetic Edda, treats dreams, drama, as frequently meaningful, sometimes prophetic, worth recounting to the household the next morning, and sometimes worth consulting someone skilled in their interpretation over. Whether every household actually took every dream that seriously, or whether that's partly a literary convention of the sagas themselves, is something historians still debate, but the underlying belief clearly ran deep enough to leave that mark on the written record centuries later. There's also, tucked into that same folk tradition, a specific fear worth knowing: the Mara, a malevolent spirit believed to sit on a sleeper's chest at night, pressing the breath out of them and leaving behind exactly the kind of suffocating, paralysed dread you might associate with a bad dream today, and it's not a coincidence that the English word nightmare descends directly from it. Tonight, in this hall, nobody seems especially anxious about it, but you notice, all the same, that nobody sleeps completely alone, either, and you can't quite decide whether that's about warmth, about comfort, or a little bit about keeping the Mara's odds down by simple numbers. At some point in the night, you're going to need to relieve yourself, and this is where the whole cosy picture runs directly into its least glamorous limitation. Stepping outside into an Icelandic or Norwegian midwinter night for that purpose is roughly the last thing anyone in this hall wants to do, and most households solve the problem the same unglamorous way most pre-modern households everywhere solved it: a covered container kept near the sleeping area, emptied in daylight, used by whoever needs it in the dark without waking the rest of the room if they can manage it. It's not dignified, it's not written about at length in any saga, because nobody in the 11th or 12th century thought it was worth writing about, any more than you'd narrate your own late-night bathroom trips in a memoir. But it's real, it's constant, and it's one more small piece of evidence for just how completely this room's architecture had to account for actual human bodies doing actual human things through an 8-hour Arctic night, rather than the tidied-up, dignified version of the past that tends to survive in the more formal written record. Here's the detail that ties the whole night back together, the one that makes this bench genuinely different from a bed as you understand a bed. By full daylight tomorrow, every trace of tonight's sleeping arrangement will be gone. The furs get folded, the straw or heather gets tidied or refreshed, and the exact bench you and Ra and her grandmother slept on becomes, within the hour, a seat for breakfast, then a workbench for repairing tools, then a seat again for the evening meal, cycling through half a dozen identities in a single day, the way almost every surface in this hall does. There's no dedicated bedroom here, no room whose only job is sleep. There's just one long room, endlessly reconfigured, asking everything in it, including the people, to be flexible enough to do more than one job. Not everyone in this world slept out in the open hall the way you're sleeping tonight. Either later Icelandic sagas make occasional mention of a lockrekja, a closed bed closet, a small enclosed sleeping compartment built against one wall of the hall with its own door or curtain, reserved in the stories for a household's most senior or important members, typically its master and mistress. It's a detail that survives more reliably in saga narrative than in excavated ruins, since a closet built largely of perishable wood and cloth leaves far less for archaeologists to find centuries later than a stone-lined hearth does, so it's worth holding a little more loosely than the physical evidence you've already seen tonight. But the underlying logic tracks with everything else you've learned about how this household allocates warmth, enclosed space traps heat more efficiently than open space, privacy and status went hand in hand in a household with almost none of either to spare, and if any sleeping arrangement in this hall came closest to a genuinely private bedroom, it would have looked something like this. A small wooden box within a larger room, one more layer of insulation wrapped around the people the household could least afford to lose. You'd be forgiven for assuming that packing a dozen or more bodies into one shared straw-lined bench night after night, all winter, comes with a cost beyond warmth. And you'd be right. Lice, fleas, and other unwelcome benchmates were a persistent, well-attested feature of pre-modern life across nearly every culture that slept the way this household sleeps, and the Norse world was no exception. Fine-toothed combs, carved from bone or antler specifically for removing lice and their eggs from hair, turn up regularly enough in Viking-age graves and settlement sites across Scandinavia and its colonies that archaeologists consider them one of the more common and unglamorous personal items of the period. Practical enough, in fact. that some scholars have noted the Norse reputation among their Anglo-Saxon and Frankish neighbours for relatively frequent bathing and grooming may have been, in part, a defensive measure against exactly this problem, rather than pure vanity. It's not the detail that makes it into most popular retellings of Viking life, all longships and raiding and carved dragon prows. It's the detail that was, on any given night in a hall like this one, considerably more immediate to the people actually living it than any battle ever was, a small, itching, universal inconvenience shared by farmhand and chieftain alike, solved the same unglamorous way, bone comb in hand, by firelight, before anyone finally settled down to sleep. If you want physical proof that even the wealthiest households in this world put real craftsmanship into the simple act of sleeping, you don't have to look further than a ship pulled out of a burial mound in Vestfold, Norway, in 1904. The Oseberg ship, dated to around 834 AD and among the richest Viking Age burials ever excavated, held, alongside its famous carved sledges and textiles, an actual wooden bed frame, carved, jointed, clearly built by a skilled hand for someone of real status. One of the only surviving physical examples of Viking Age bedroom furniture anywhere in the archaeological record. Since wood this old almost never survives outside of the rare waterlogged or otherwise unusually preserving conditions a burial mound like Oseberg happened to provide. It's a small, humbling reminder every time it comes up. The straw and fur bench Ra and her grandmother are sharing tonight is the version of sleep available to almost everyone in this world, while a carved bed frame, folded away in a queen or noblewoman's burial mound, tells you what sleep looked like for the very small number of people who could afford not to share a bench with the rest of the household at all. For everyone else, on the coldest nights, the household reaches for one more low-tech trick before anyone finally stops moving. A stone or two, set at the fire's edge earlier in the evening until they've soaked up real lasting heat, then wrapped in a scrap of cloth and tucked down near the feet of whoever's bench needs it most, usually Ra's bench, tonight, or wherever the youngest or oldest sleepers have settled. It's not a sophisticated technology by any measure, and it wouldn't surprise you to learn nearly every cold climate culture in history arrived at some close variant of the same idea independently. But watching someone quietly slide a warm cloth-wrapped stone down under a child's blanket, without a word exchanged about it, without any expectation of thanks, tells you something the law codes and the excavated hearths can't quite capture on their own, that for all the harsh practicality running through every other decision made in this hall tonight, somebody, every single night, is still doing the small unnecessary kindness anyway. Nobody chose their bench tonight at random, either, and the arrangement tells you almost as much about this household's social order as it does about warmth. The most honoured seat in any Norse hall was the envegi, the high seat, typically positioned along the hall's long wall roughly opposite the main door, reserved for the head of the household or an honoured guest, and among wealthier or more established farms, sometimes flanked by a pair of elaborately carved wooden pillars known as envegisla, high seat pillars. Treated with enough ceremonial weight that later saga tradition, including the account of Iceland's legendary first permanent Norse settler, Ingolfur Arnason, in the Landen map, describes settlers throwing their own high seat pillars overboard while approaching an unfamiliar coastline and building their new farm wherever the pillars eventually washed ashore, trusting the gods to choose the site rather than choosing it themselves. Whether every household really practiced that specific ritual, or whether its partly literary flourish added when the story was finally written down centuries later, is impossible to say for certain, but the underlying seriousness with which this culture treated seating position, awake or asleep, clearly wasn't invented by the saga writers out of nothing, positioned by rank, by relationship to the household head, by whether you were free or thrall, guest or family. Where you sat tonight was where you slept tonight, and both told the whole room, without a word needing to be spoken, exactly where you stood in it. Somewhere near the warmest curve of that arrangement, tucked into a low wooden cradle, lined with the same soft, dried bedding material as everyone else's bench, an infant sleeps through most of this without stirring, swaddled tightly in wool against a cold that shows considerably less mercy to a baby than to anyone else in the room. Infant mortality across the medieval and Viking Age world was steep by any modern measure, a fact grim enough that it barely needs restating, and a cold, dark winter placed real and additional strain on the households least equipped to absorb another loss. Which is exactly why an infant here sleeps closest to the warmest point in the entire hall, tended not by one dedicated caretaker, but by whichever adult happens to be nearest when a small sound needs answering. The same distributed, everybody's responsibility instinct that keeps the long fire alive through the night applied, without anyone needing to formalise it, to the household's smallest and most fragile member as well. Before any of that quiet settles in properly, though, there's usually one last hour of work by firelight that has nothing to do with sleep at all, and everything to do with making sure tomorrow's cold doesn't catch anyone unprepared. Torn seams, a frayed mitten, a boot sole starting to separate from long days out checking livestock, all of it gets mended now, in the last stretch of decent light the long fire provides, rather than left for a morning that will arrive dark and rushed. Needles here are typically bone or bronze, thread spun from the same wool that fills every bench and blanket in this hall, and the work itself falls disproportionately, though not exclusively, to the household's women, whose skill with cloth carried real economic and practical weight in a world where a torn cloak wasn't a minor inconvenience, but a genuine risk the next time someone had to cross open ground in a storm. You watch the Schfrager mend a small tear in a child's mitten with quick, unhurried stitches, glancing up now and then at the room's general rhythm, the way anyone in charge of a household eventually learns to do, without seeming to actively watch anything at all. It's unglamorous work, performed in low light, by tired hands, at the very end of a long day, and it's also, quietly, one more piece of the same overall system, keeping this entire hall alive through the winter, mended thread by mended thread. There's one more sound worth noticing before the whole hall finally goes quiet for the night, and it's the one nobody in this room bothers to comment on, because it's simply always there, the low, constant murmur of at least a few people talking softly, even after most of the room has gone still, voices pitched deliberately low enough not to wake anyone nearby. Some of it is ordinary household business finished late, tomorrow's chores, a decision about which animal to slaughter next if the feed runs short, a half-finished argument nobody wanted to let go unsettled overnight. Some of it, on the coldest, longest nights, is nothing more than two people keeping each other company in the dark a little longer before sleep finally takes them. The same instinct that put Ra next to her grandmother, rather than alone on her own bench. What that whole soundscape adds up to, breathing, low talk, a fire settling into ash, a baby occasionally shifting in its cradle, is a room that never actually goes fully silent, not even at its quietest hour, because silence in a house like this has never once meant safety. Noise means the household is still there, still breathing, still, in whatever small way, awake enough to notice if something goes wrong. It's a strange comfort to fall asleep inside, but by the second or third hour you'll notice it stops feeling strange at all. What happens to a household when that same nightly routine has to be improvised from scratch, in unfamiliar territory, with an enemy kingdom's soldiers a few miles off, rather than a trusted neighbour's farm? That's a considerably less forgiving version of the same problem. And it's exactly the situation an army of thousands found itself facing on the banks of an English river. An entire household improvising warmth from straw, borrowed body heat, and one warm stone wrapped in cloth is one kind of problem. An army of thousands camped in hostile territory, with no farm, no ancestral bench, and no local knowledge of the landscape to fall back on, is a considerably harder version of the exact same math, and English soil has been quietly keeping the receipts for well over 1,000 years. In 1686, workers on a Derbyshire hillside above the River Trent, near the small village of Repton, broke into a mound and found it packed with human bone, a jumbled mass of skeletal remains that local tradition, for the next 3 centuries, associated vaguely and half-accurately with the Danes. It wasn't until archaeologists Martin Biddle and Berth Chelby Biddle properly excavated the site in the 1970s and 1980s that the mound's real contents came into focus. The disarticulated remains of roughly 264 individuals, the great majority of them adult men, packed into a rectangular stone-lined chamber that had originally been part of an Anglo-Saxon building, later covered over by a low burial mound. For years, radiocarbon dates from the bones seemed to place the deposit a century or two too early to match the historical record anyone actually cared about. It took a 2018 reassessment, led by archaeologist Kat Jarman, applying a correction for what's known as the marine reservoir effect, a well-understood quirk in which a diet rich in fish and other marine protein throws off standard radiocarbon dating by making bone appear artificially older, to bring the whole deposit convincingly back into a single narrow window, the winter of 873 to 874 AD, which happens to be exactly when a very specific army was known, from written sources, to have been camped at Repton for the winter. That army has a name history remembers as the Great Heathen Army, a large, unusually persistent Scandinavian force that first landed in East Anglia in 865 AD, and then did something most earlier Viking raiding parties hadn't bothered attempting. It stayed. Rather than a single summer raid followed by a retreat back across the North Sea, this force campaigned across England for well over a decade, moving from kingdom to kingdom, and in doing so it had to solve, again and again, the exact same seasonal problem every farming household back home already understood instinctively. You cannot fight, march, or sail effectively through a northern European winter, so you find somewhere to sit it out, and you build whatever shelter that requires from whatever the local landscape happens to offer. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a set of annals compiled and continued across multiple English monasteries starting around this same period, records the army taking winter quarters in a sequence of different locations across these years, among them Thetford in 869 to 870, and later Torksey and Repton, each stop representing months of a foreign army effectively becoming, temporarily, a fixed and fortified town. Torksey, on the River Trent in modern Lincolnshire, gives archaeologists their clearest picture yet of just how large and how settled one of these winter camps could actually become. A long-running metal detecting and field survey project led by archaeologists Dawn Hadley and Julian Richards, working with local detectorists over more than a decade, has recovered thousands of objects from the fields around Torksey: coins, weights used for measuring hack silver in trade, gaming pieces for board games played to pass long idle hours, dress pins, and fragments of imported goods that suggest active commerce rather than simple military occupation. Their surveys suggest the camp, occupied over the winter of 872 to 873, may have sprawled across an area of 55 hectares or more, considerably larger than most contemporary English towns of the period, assembled from nothing in a matter of weeks, by a force that, by some estimates drawn from the density and spread of these finds, likely numbered well into the thousands. This wasn't a war camp in the narrow sense of tents and picket lines. It functioned for one full winter as something closer to a temporary city, complete with its own internal economy, trading silver by weight the same way Vamel changed hands as currency back in Iceland and Norway. Repton, the following winter, shows a different and more explicitly defensive kind of engineering. The army built a D-shaped earthwork enclosure directly against the bank of the River Trent, roughly 1.5 hectares in area. Using the river itself as one long, unbroken defensive edge, water on one side meant no wall needed there. And it meant ships could be beached or moored directly against the camp's own perimeter, keeping the army's fleet, its primary means of both transport and escape, close and protected through the coldest months, cleverly, and with a certain blunt practicality that runs through every choice this force made. The earthworks builders incorporated the existing Anglo-Saxon stone church of St. Wystan directly into their defences, repurposing an already standing structure as a fortified strongpoint rather than building one from scratch. It's the same instinct, scaled up to military engineering, that drove an Icelandic farmer to build a buffered entry passage, or a household to bank its coals under ash, rather than start a new fire from nothing each morning. Don't build what you can adapt. Raising that earthwork at all, in the handful of weeks between arrival and the season's first hard frost, was itself no small undertaking. A defensive ditch and rampart running roughly 1/3 of a kilometre around the enclosed area meant moving an enormous volume of earth by hand, spade, basket and raw human effort, the same fundamental toolkit that raised the burial mounds and boundary walls of every farming community these men had left behind in Scandinavia, piled and packed into a bank steep and solid enough to slow down a determined assault, then very likely capped or reinforced with a timber palisade along its crest, following a pattern seen at other Viking Age fortifications across Scandinavia and its colonies. It's easy, looking at a modern archaeological plan of the site, a tidy D-shaped outline traced in string and survey pegs, to forget that every metre of that outline once represented real hours of cold, muddy labour performed by men who had also, somehow, still needed to eat, sleep and keep watch while they dug. The same turf-cutting skill that built Oun's metre-thick walls back home, and the same skill that raised Stingier's earthen banks in a quiet Icelandic valley, travelled with this army all the way to the banks of the Trent, repurposed from insulation into fortification without missing a step. Inside that rampart, the camp ran on an economy as real and as calculating as any market town's, complete with its own internal logic of value and exchange, just conducted almost entirely by weight rather than by coin, as such transactions are understood today. Hoards of hack silver, coins, jewellery and ingots, deliberately chopped into smaller fragments so their value could be measured out precisely on a set of folding bronze scales, several of which have turned up among the Torksey finds, point to a camp economy built on bullion rather than trust in any single currency's face value, a practical necessity for a coalition drawn from dozens of different mints and regions with no shared coinage of their own. Local populations, for their part, seem to have engaged in at least some willing trade with the camp alongside whatever more coercive tribute the army also extracted by simple force of numbers. The presence of English coins minted specifically in this period among the Torksey finds suggests goods and silver moved in both directions and uneasy. Transactional coexistence between an occupying force and the very kingdom it was simultaneously extorting. It's not a comfortable picture, and the sources don't pretend it should be. But it is, once again, the same underlying math every household in this story keeps solving in its own way. Feed everyone, keep everyone sheltered, and figure out, however uneasily, how to make it through to spring, for the kingdom hosting it, whether it wanted to or not. Mercia, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom in whose territory Repton sat, had its king, Burgred, driven into exile during this campaign. He ultimately travelled to Rome, where he died, ending a reign that had lasted over 2 decades. In his place, the chronicle records, the great army installed a replacement, Ceolwulf II, described in the sources with open contempt as little more than a puppet ruler answering to Viking interests, rather than his own kingdoms. It's a stark reminder of what a single well-chosen winter camp could actually accomplish beyond simple survival, not just shelter for an army, but functional leverage over an entire kingdom's throne, achieved without, as far as the surviving record shows, a single major pitched battle fought at Repton itself. Survival at that scale, though, came with its own brutal arithmetic, and the Repton mass grave itself preserves the evidence. Analysis of the roughly 264 individuals in that charnel deposit found that a clear majority, by some published estimates as many as 4 in 5, show no skeletal signs of violent trauma at all, which argues against the tidy assumption that this was purely a battle-dead memorial. Overcrowded winter camps holding thousands of people and their animals through several cold months were, across almost every documented period of pre-modern history, prone to exactly the kind of outbreak that leaves no mark on bone, dysentery, typhoid, and similar diseases that spread readily through contaminated water and close quarters, a threat that had nothing to do with English resistance and everything to do with basic sanitation failing under the sheer, unglamorous pressure of thousands of people, and likely a comparable number of horses and livestock sharing one confined stretch of riverbank for months at a stretch. Waste, contaminated water, and close quarters doing what waste, contaminated water, and close quarters have done to crowded populations across nearly every century of recorded history, whether the people involved carried swords or not. Isotopy analysis of the same remains, measuring strontium and oxygen ratios locked into tooth enamel during childhood, which vary geographically and can indicate roughly where a person grew up, found individuals whose origins trace back across a wide swath of Scandinavia and beyond, confirming that this was no single homogeneous warband from one town, but a coalition drawn from many different communities, unified for one prolonged campaign and, in the end, sharing one collective grave. Among the individuals buried near the main deposit, one particular grave has drawn outsized attention, and it's worth flagging clearly as informed speculation rather than settled fact. A high-status burial found close to the charnel mound. A man in his late 30s or 40s, buried with a sword, a Thor's hammer pendant, and, strikingly, a boar's tusk placed between his legs, which some researchers, Kat Jarman among them, have read as a possible attempt to symbolically restore a battle wound to the genital area, has occasionally been linked, cautiously and without proof, to Ivar, a leader remembered in later saga tradition as Ivar the Boneless, one of the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. The connection between saga tradition figures like Ivar and the actual historical leadership of the great heathen army is genuinely uncertain, resting on later dramatised Norse literary sources written generations after the events they describe. The same kind of source the accuracy of Golden Age pirate legend later depended on, and the same kind of source worth treating with real caution rather than flat acceptance. What the grave does confirm, regardless of whose name eventually belongs to it, is that this winter camp held people of genuinely elevated status, buried with real ceremony, among thousands of others who weren't. Not everyone inside Torxie's 55 hectares was a warrior, either, and that detail matters more than it might first seem to. Among the objects recovered from the site are items typically associated with women and children, dress pins, a spindle haul, small personal items unlikely to belong to a purely military force, suggesting that at least some of the people wintering there were families, not soldiers alone, travelling with an army that had, by this point in its long English campaign, become something closer to a mobile, itinerant society than a raiding party in the traditional sense. It reframes the whole picture a little. This wasn't simply an occupying force enduring a hostile winter far from home. For some portion of the people camped along the Trent that year, this fortified 55-hectare sprawl of tents, workshops, and traded silver was, for the length of one long winter, simply home, improvised, temporary, built from nothing in a matter of weeks, but home all the same, in the same basic sense that Aoun's turf-walled hall or Sting's carefully refined longhouse was home to the people who built and refined those instead. This is the story of a winter camp that reshaped a kingdom's throne without needing a single named battle to do it, proof that surviving the cold, done well enough and at large enough scale, could function as its own kind of conquest. By 874, the coalition that had wintered at Repton began to split. Part of the army, under a leader named Halfdan, moved north to campaign further and eventually began settling and dividing land among its own followers, the beginning of what later English sources would call the Dunny Law, a swath of eastern and northern England under direct Scandinavian control and cultural influence for generations afterward. Another part, under a leader named Guthrum, continued campaigning further south, eventually clashing with the West Saxon King Alfred in a struggle that would, within a few more years, reshape the political map of England yet again. Neither branch of that story is really about a single battle, in the end, however much popular memory tends to compress it into one. It's about an army that learned, camp by camp, winter by winter, Thetford, Torxie, Repton, exactly how to keep thousands of people fed, sheltered, and alive through a season that had already ended plenty of less patient expeditions before them, and used that hard-won survival skill as leverage nearly as effective as any sword. Every one of those fortified camps, Repton included, existed for one purpose beyond simple shelter that's easy to overlook amid the politics and the mass grave: protecting the fleet that had brought this army to England in the first place, and that would need to carry it onward once spring finally broke. Longships left in open water through a hard freeze risked being crushed or damaged by shifting river ice, so wintering fleets were typically hauled out onto the bank entirely, or moored in the calmest, most sheltered stretch of river the camp's chosen site could offer, which is precisely why both Torksey and Repton sit directly on navigable rivers, the Trent in both cases, rather than inland. Beached hulls could be inspected, recaulked, and repaired at leisure over the winter months, rather than rushed through in the brief window between raiding seasons, using the same pine tar, wool caulking, and iron rivets any Norse shipwright back home would recognise instantly. It meant a camp like Repton wasn't just an army's temporary town. It was also, for one full winter, a working shipyard, one more skill this whole culture had refined over generations, applied now several hundred miles from the fjords and boatsheds where most of these particular hands had first learned it. Guthrum's own branch of the story reached its resolution a few years later, and it's worth following it that far, because it shows how completely one bad winter could reroute a person's entire life. After further campaigning against Wessex, Guthrum suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of Edington in 878 at the hands of King Alfred, the same Alfred later remembered as Alfred the Great, one of the few Anglo-Saxon rulers to hold his kingdom against the Great Army's advance, rather than lose it outright. The peace that followed, formalised in what's usually called the Treaty of Wedmore, required something considerably more personal than a withdrawal of troops. Guthrum's baptism into Christianity, with Alfred himself standing as his sponsor, and Guthrum taking the new baptismal name Thelstan. It's a strange, almost quiet ending for a man who had, only a handful of years earlier, been party to driving a Mercian king into permanent exile from a fortified camp on the Trent. Whether Guthrum's conversion reflected genuine belief or simple political calculation is a question the sources don't fully settle either way, and historians remain divided on how sincerely to read it. But the treaty held, more or less, for the rest of his life, and the man who once wintered behind an earthen rampart on foreign soil eventually settled, under his new name, to rule a portion of East Anglia as a Christian king, rather than a raiding one, proof that even the most disruptive winter campaign in this whole story eventually had to end somewhere, and that somewhere, for Guthrum at least, turned out to be a font of water rather than a battlefield. Not every hour inside a winter camp this size went toward fortification, trade, or ship repair either, and some of the smaller finds recovered from Torksey's fields speak to exactly how thousands of people, confined together for months with genuinely little to do once the day's practical work was finished, actually passed the idle stretches of a long, dark English winter. Lead gaming pieces, worn smooth from handling, turn up among the site's metal-detected finds in real numbers, evidence of board games, likely a Norse strategy game broadly comparable to what's now called Nefataphil, a contest of attacker versus defender played on a checkered board, occupying hands and attention around a fire that had nowhere else to send them for months at a stretch. It's a small, human detail easy to lose beneath the earthworks and the mass graves and the toppled Mercian king, but worth holding on to precisely because it is so small, an army capable of ending one kingdom's royal line and founding the beginnings of another still spent plenty of its actual winter evenings the same way any household back in Norway or Iceland spent theirs, hunched close to a fire, moving pieces across a board, waiting out the dark until the calendar finally handed spring back to them. There's a version of courage in this story that has nothing to do with combat at all, and it's worth sitting with before moving on. Every fortified winter camp this army built, the earthwork at Repton, the sprawling trading ground at Torksey, represents thousands of individual decisions about shelter, fuel, food and sanitation made under real pressure, far from any home farm's accumulated generations of local knowledge. Some of those decisions clearly worked, well enough to help topple a kingdom's line of kings. Some of them, judging by that mass grave above the Trent, did not work at all, and cost roughly 200 people their lives to something as unglamorous and unheroic as bad water. Survival, this far north, in this century, was never guaranteed by numbers or by reputation alone. It had to be built, camp by camp, the same patient way a fire gets hushed under ash each night, and sometimes, no matter how carefully it was built, it still wasn't enough. An army's winter camp solves the cold at the scale of thousands, with earthworks and hoarded silver and an entire improvised economy built to see it through. But underneath every one of those larger systems, the actual work of getting a household or a warband through a single specific night still comes down to one person, awake when everyone else is asleep, deciding, hour by hour, whether the fire lives or dies. The cold reaches your face first, the instant the outer door swings open, not the dry, manageable cold of stepping outside on a clear afternoon, but a wetter, heavier cold that seems to settle directly into your jaw and the bridge of your nose within seconds. Oun steps out ahead of you without hesitation, the way you'd expect from someone who's done this same short errand 1,000 times before, checking the depth of new snow against the doorframe and the state of the sky, before ducking back inside. Tonight, it turns out, you're keeping the Vakant with him, the Wake Knight, the household's shorthand for whoever draws the duty of staying alert through the darkest hours to mind the fire, the animals, and anything else that might need a decision made before morning. It's not framed to you as a punishment or even particularly as an honour. It's simply a rotation, and tonight it happens to include you. By early dusk, the hall has settled into its evening rhythm, and your first real task alongside Oun is banking the long fire down from the roaring blaze it's been all evening into something calmer and more sustainable, pulling burning logs toward the trench's centre, letting the outer embers begin their slow cool, judging by eye and long habit exactly how much fuel this particular stretch of. Night is going to need. Oun works with almost no wasted motion, and you notice, watching him, that he checks the woodpile's remaining stock the same way a ship's navigator might check remaining provisions, not anxiously, but with the settled awareness of someone who has done the math on how many logs a night like this one actually requires, and knows to within a log or two whether tonight's supply will cover it. By the second hour past midnight, the temperature outside has dropped further still, and the hall itself has gone almost entirely silent except for breathing and the fire's low tick. Even the dog that spent the evening stretched near the hearth has burrowed further into the straw, nose tucked under its own tail, and you find yourself unconsciously copying the posture, curling a little tighter under your borrowed fur. This is when you first hear it, a deep, resonant crack, carrying faintly from the direction of the fjord, followed a moment later by another, sharper this time. Oun doesn't so much as glance toward the sound. Ice, he tells you quietly, doing what ice does on a night this cold, contracting, splitting under its own internal stress, throwing off a sound that can carry for a surprising distance across still, frozen water. It's not a threat, not tonight, but it's the kind of sound a household spends generations learning to recognize instantly, rather than startle at, filing it away in the same mental category as wind in the jury or a settling roof beam, ordinary winter noise, catalogued and dismissed before it can properly become alarming. Between the ice and the neighbour's knock, there's a second errand that pulls both of you away from the fire's edge for a stretch of the night, and it takes you down toward the byre end of the hall, past the wooden partition separating human sleep from livestock. Your breath fogs visibly even here, well inside the building's walls, and you understand immediately why. This end of the hall runs noticeably cooler than the fire-warmed benches you just left, close enough to outside temperatures that the animal's own body heat is doing the bulk of the work rather than any residual warmth carrying over from the long fire. Oun moves along the row of tethered cattle with a small lamp held low, checking each animal in turn, a hand run briefly along a flank, an ear tuned for the particular rasp of laboured breathing that might signal illness setting in. One young animal, thinner than the rest and standing with its head lower than Oun clearly likes, gets a longer look, and an extra armful of hay pulled from the loft above, along with a murmured word you don't quite catch. Livestock lost to a hard winter wasn't an abstract loss in a household like this one, and everyone here, right down to the youngest child on the bench, understands that plainly enough not to need it explained. Later Icelandic annals record specific bad years remembered largely by their livestock toll, sheep and cattle dying in their pens in numbers severe enough to threaten a farm's entire following year, and a single animal showing early signs of trouble, caught and tended in the dead of night rather than discovered dead by morning, could genuinely be the difference between an ordinary winter and a ruinous one. Somewhere close to the coldest part of the night, a fist raps against the outer door, and a neighbour, a man from a farm perhaps half an hour's walk distant on a summer day, considerably longer through tonight's drifted snow, pushes inside half frozen, bringing news rather than trouble. He'd been out checking on a flock of sheep folded near his own property line, and had spotted at a distance what he was fairly certain were wolf tracks crossing fresh through the new snow, close enough to worry about, but not, as far as he could tell, close enough tonight to act on immediately. Owen listens, asks 2 or 3 practical questions about direction and how fresh the tracks looked, and files the information away the same unhurried way he filed away the sound of the ice. Not panic, just another data point folded into tomorrow's decisions about where to graze which animals. It's a small, unremarkable exchange delivered second-hand by a half-frozen neighbour rather than announced by any grander authority, and it tells you something true about how news travelled in a world like this one, person to person, door to door, through exactly the kind of dark, cold night that made every single trip to deliver it a real and measured act of goodwill. Later, well past what you'd guess is the night's midpoint, a pale, shifting curtain of green light ripples faintly across a break in the cloud cover outside, visible for a few seconds through the doorway before the neighbour, now settled by the fire himself for what remains of the night, steps back inside and pulls the door shut against the cold. The northern lights, he says, unprompted, in the specific tone of someone repeating something he heard from his own grandmother rather than something he necessarily believes outright. Some say they're the reflected glow off a Valkyrie's shield, or a shimmer along Bifrost, the bridge said in later medieval Icelandic mythological writing, to connect the world of gods to the world of men. It's worth being honest about where a claim like that actually sits. This specific interpretation survives mainly through later medieval sources and folk tradition, recorded well after the Viking Age itself, and there's no way to confirm it reflects universal Norse belief rather than one regional strand of it, passed down and reshaped generation to generation the way most oral folklore is. Owen, for his part, offers no opinion on Valkyries one way or the other. He's more interested in whether the clearing sky means a harder frost by morning, which, practically speaking, matters rather more to tonight's fire than any bridge to Asgard does. A cold house is a poor house's greatest theft. It's a saying Owen repeats at some point deep in the night, half to you and half to himself, the kind of compact proverb that circulates through a household's oral tradition long enough to lose track of exactly who first said it. Whether it's a genuine period expression preserved faithfully across the centuries, or a phrase reshaped and simplified somewhere along the way, is honestly impossible to verify from where you're sitting. What isn't in doubt is the truth underneath it. In a world with no thermostat, no insurance, no safety net beyond the household's own accumulated skill, losing the fire on the coldest night of the year wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was, in the most literal sense available to this century, a form of theft, of warmth, of stored food that would spoil without heat to process it, potentially of lives. Owen has a story of his own he tells you somewhere in that same long stretch of quiet, offered the way people offer cautionary tales at this hour. Half warning, half something closer to entertainment, a way of filling the dark with a voice rather than silence. 2 valleys over, he says, there was once a household whose fire went out completely on the coldest night anyone in the region could remember, the whole family caught asleep with no coals left worth reviving, and no dry kindling close enough to hand to rebuild fast enough. Whether that specific household, that specific night, and that specific outcome happened exactly the way Owen tells it is impossible for you to verify, and it carries every hallmark of a story reshaped a little further from the truth with each telling, the way any oral cautionary tale tends to sharpen its edges over the years to make sure the lesson lands. What matters, listening to it, isn't whether the details survive intact. It's that a story like this one exists at all, passed household to household, precisely because everyone in this world understood, without needing statistics to prove it, that the fire wasn't just a comfort. It was the actual, literal boundary between an ordinary bad night and a story other households would still be telling their own children, cautiously, generations later. You ask him at some point in that long stretch before the sky shows any hint of lightning how much longer he expects to be doing this. The fire, the wake nights, the decades of quiet. Unglamorous reliability you watched pay off once already, back on the night you first arrived. He's quiet for a moment before answering, and when he does, there's something steadier in his voice than you expected. 2 more winters, he tells you, maybe 3, and the debt of his service, negotiated, as it happens, in exactly the kind of long. Patient trust this household has clearly come to place in him, will be settled, and he'll stand in this hall a free man rather than a thrall bound to it. It's not framed as a certainty carved in stone. Plenty could still go wrong between now and then. A bad harvest, a hard winter, a shift in the household's fortunes that changes the calculation entirely. But he says it the way a person says something they've turned over often enough, in exactly this kind of long, quiet hour, that it stopped being a hope and started being closer to a plan. You'd assumed, before tonight, that keeping awake through hours this dark and this featureless would be mostly guesswork, but Aoun tracks the night's progress with a quiet, practiced precision that surprises you. He steps out periodically to check the sky rather than any instrument, the position of particular stars against the tree line or the hall's own roof line, the moon's height and phase where cloud cover allows it through, small fixed reference points he's clearly used this same way for years. It's not a formal system with a name you'd recognise, and it isn't perfectly precise by any modern standard of an hour's length. But it doesn't need to be. What it needs to do is tell Aoun roughly how much darkness remains, so he can pace the household's dwindling woodpile against it, rather than either running short before dawn or leaving good fuel unused come morning. Norse communities further north, well within the Arctic Circle, faced a version of this problem, so extreme it barely resembled ordinary nighttime at all, weeks at a stretch at the depth of winter, where the sun never properly rose. And any system for marking time had to run almost entirely on the stars, the moon, and the accumulated unspoken habit of bodies that had learned, across generations, to keep a rhythm the sky itself could no longer reliably provide. The coldest stretch of the whole night arrives, as it almost always does, in the hour or two just before any hint of dawn, a physiological reality as much as a folk observation, since the human body's core temperature, along with the outside air itself, tends to bottom out in these final hours of darkness, rather than at true midnight. You feel it yourself, if you're honest, in a way you hadn't during the earlier, merely uncomfortable stretches of the night, a deeper, more stubborn chill working its way into fingers and toes, no matter how close you sit to the fire's residual heat, the particular fatigue-driven cold that settles into a body running on borrowed sleep and half-attention. It's the same window of vulnerability that later medical understanding would confirm applies broadly to hypothermia risk in any cold environment. This pre-dawn trough, when both the ambient air and the body's own internal thermostat sink to their lowest ebb of the whole cycle, and it's exactly the stretch of night a household's oldest and youngest members are least equipped to weather unassisted. This is when Aoun checks the bench nearest the fire most carefully, adjusting a fur that slipped from around Ra's shoulders, resting a hand briefly against an elderly relative's cheek to judge, by simple touch, whether the skin still feels warm enough. It's the same triage instinct you noticed on your very first night in this hall, and watching it repeated now, in the depth of genuine cold rather than merely its evening approach, you understand it differently. Not a one-time act of kindness, but a discipline, practiced and repeated every single night by whoever happens to be holding the wake, precisely because this specific hour is exactly when a household's carefully built margin for error gets tested hardest. It surprises you, somewhere in that last stretch before light, to learn that the wake night doesn't always fall to Aoun specifically, even if it's landed on him more often than not this particular winter. The duty rotates, at least in principle, through most of the household's able adults, free and thrall alike, the Shreya herself having held it plenty of winters before her own children were old enough to share the load, a farmhand taking his turn same as anyone. It's one of the few tasks in this hall that status doesn't fully exempt a person from, because the cost of getting it wrong falls on everyone equally, regardless of who's sleeping closest to the door or who holds the high seat come daylight. That doesn't erase the real and permanent difference between Aoun's position and a free household member's. Nobody here is pretending thraldom and freedom carry the same weight, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. But for these specific hours, in this specific room, the fire doesn't check anyone's status before it needs tending, and the household's survival tonight depends, in practice, on whoever's actually awake doing the work well, rather than on who technically outranks whom in daylight. There's a strange private beauty to this hour too, one you hadn't expected to find waiting for you at the bottom of so much cold and vigilance. Frost has crept across every seam and gap in the doorframe overnight, fine white crystals branching in patterns you could study for an hour if exhaustion weren't pulling at you so insistently, and for one suspended moment, before Aoun starts moving again, the whole hall sits in a kind of held stillness. Coals banked, animals quiet, every sleeping body accounted for, nothing left undone. It's not a moment anyone in this household would think to remark on out loud. Nobody keeps a record of it. But it's there every clear night like this one, for whoever happens to be the one still awake to see it. Proof, however briefly, that the whole exhausting machinery of getting a household through a single dark night had, for these few minutes at least, actually worked. You feel your own exhaustion catching up with you in a way that's hard to ignore by this point. The specific heavy-limbed fatigue of a body that hasn't slept and knows on some instinctive level that it should have. Aoun, for his part, shows almost none of it outwardly, though you notice him blink longer than usual once or twice, and catch him pressing the heel of his hand briefly against one eye before returning, without comment, to the fire. Staying awake through an entire cold night, night after night, across a whole winter, takes a toll that nobody in this hall would think to name in the language you might use for it, sleep debt, fatigue, anything clinical, but that they clearly understand all the same in the practical, physical terms of a body that gets slower and colder the longer it goes without proper rest. It's part of why the wake night rotates at all, rather than falling permanently to one person, no matter how skilled they've become at it, even the most reliable fire tender in the household needs. Eventually, a night of uninterrupted sleep of his own, or the whole careful system built around his competence, starts to wear thin at exactly the moment it can least afford to. A lesson this household has clearly learned the hard way at some point in its own past, judging by how carefully the rotation gets tracked and honoured even on nights when Aoun, characteristically, half offers to take it again anyway. By the time the first genuinely grey light finds its way through the eldery, Aoun is already crouched at the fire's edge, breaking apart the ash-covered mound of coals he built hours earlier and coaxing them, patient breath by patient breath, back toward open flame. It catches within a few minutes, a small, satisfying lick of orange finding dry kindling and holding, and something in his shoulders visibly relaxes, the small, private relief of a job that has once again been done successfully. The household will wake soon to a hall already warming rather than one starting cold, and none of them will ever know, in any specific sense, just how many careful decisions across the night made that warmth possible by the time they open their eyes. That's the whole quiet point of the role Aoun has spent years mastering. Nobody's supposed to notice the wake night went well. They're only ever supposed to notice if it didn't. Not every fear that kept a household's eyes open through a night like this one was about ice, or wolves, or a fire running low, though. Some of the deepest winter dread in this world came from somewhere considerably older and considerably harder to rake back into order by morning. A set of stories about the winter that never ended at all. Aoun's fire held. His household's winter, this year, is the kind of story that never gets written down anywhere. Precisely because it went well. No drama, no disaster, just a coal bed carefully hushed under ash, night after night, until spring finally arrived to make the whole exhausting routine unnecessary for a few months. Not every Norse winter in memory ended that quietly, though. Somewhere behind every fear this culture carried about the cold, behind every proverb, every superstition traded at the hearth's edge, every careful nightly ritual for keeping a household's fire alive until dawn, sat one shared half-remembered story about a winter so complete it never actually ended at all. Picture a farming settlement somewhere in what's now central Sweden, sometime in the year 536, on a day that should have been the height of a northern summer. The sun rises, more or less on schedule, but something about its light is wrong, thinner, paler, cast through a haze that never quite clears, no matter how many hours pass. A contemporary writer working thousands of miles away in Constantinople, the Byzantine historian Procopius, recorded something strikingly similar happening across the Mediterranean world that same year. The sun, he wrote, gave out a light without brightness, like a partial eclipse that simply never resolved, lasting for the better part of a year. Whatever this settlement's farmers made of it in the moment, and no direct written account from Scandinavia itself survives to tell us exactly how they explained it to each other around their own hearths, the practical consequence would have been unmistakable within a single growing season. Crops that should have ripened under a normal summer sun simply didn't, or did so late and thin, in a climate that offered almost no margin for a failed harvest to begin with. Modern science has spent the last several decades reconstructing exactly what happened that year, and the picture it's assembled is genuinely unsettling in its scale. Dendrochronologists, researchers who study the width of tree rings, which grow narrower in cold, difficult-growing seasons and wider in good ones, have identified an extraordinary, multi-year band of stunted growth beginning precisely in 536 and persisting in samples pulled from trees as far apart as Ireland, Scandinavia, and parts of Asia, for well over a decade afterward, among the most severe and widespread short-term cooling events of the last 2,000 years by this particular measure. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica, meanwhile, preserve sharp spikes of volcanic sulfate deposited in this same narrow window, physical evidence of at least one and quite possibly 2 or 3 major volcanic eruptions occurring in rapid succession, their ash and sulfur aerosols spreading through the upper atmosphere and dimming sunlight worldwide for years at a stretch. Exactly which volcano or volcanoes triggered it remains a genuinely open question among researchers. Candidates proposed over the years have included eruptions in Iceland and a documented massive eruption at Ilopango in present-day El Salvador. And the scientific debate over the precise source is very much still unsettled rather than resolved. What isn't in doubt, from the tree rings and the ice cores alike, is the scale of what followed, several consecutive years, by some reconstructions closer to a full decade, of a genuinely and measurably colder world. Archaeologists working specifically in Scandinavia have found their own physical fingerprint of that crisis, distinct from the tree rings and ice cores, but consistent with them. Pollen analysis and settlement surveys across parts of central Sweden show farmland that had been cleared and cultivated for generations abruptly reverting to forest during roughly this same period. Fields simply abandoned, never replanted, the clearest kind of archaeological signature a population decline or mass relocation tends to leave behind. Researchers Bo Gersland and Neil Price, publishing an influential and still widely discussed study in the journal Antiquity in 2012, proposed that this same crisis left an even deeper mark than abandoned fields, a surge in the ritual deposition of gold hoards buried in bogs and other significant locations across Scandinavia during this period, which they read as evidence of a society in genuine religious crisis, attempting, through increasingly desperate sacrifice, to appease gods who seem to have withdrawn the sun itself. It's an interpretation other scholars have debated and refined rather than universally accepted outright, and it's worth treating as an informed, actively discussed hypothesis rather than settled consensus. But the underlying timing, genuine climate catastrophe, genuine archaeological evidence of social disruption, both centred on this same narrow window in the 6th century, is not in dispute. This is the story of Fimbulwinter, the myth this same culture eventually told about its own worst fear. And whether one specific historical winter actually gave birth to it, or simply confirmed something this culture had always half suspected the cold was capable of, nobody can say with certainty today. The myth itself survives most fully in texts written down centuries after the Viking Age had already ended, chiefly in the 13th century prose Edda, compiled by the Icelandic scholar and politician Snorri Sturluson, drawing on older poetic material including the poem Vafnismal. Fimbulvetur. The mighty winter, or great winter, is described as 3 consecutive winters with no summer at all between them, a cold so total and so prolonged that it functions, in the mythology, as the direct prelude to Ragnarok itself, the wolves Skell and Hati finally catching and devouring the sun and moon they'd chased across the sky since the beginning of the world, plunging everything into permanent dark just before the final battle between gods and giants that ends this entire cosmic order. It's worth being clear about what kind of source this is. Snorri was writing as a Christian scholar in medieval Iceland, centuries removed from the pre-Christian belief system he was recording, working partly from older poetry and partly, almost certainly, from his own literary shaping of inherited material, so Fimbulwinter as we have it today is a myth filtered through at least one significant layer of later interpretation, not a transcript straight from a Viking Age storyteller's mouth. But the core image at its centre, winter, not as a season that ends, but as a force capable of simply refusing to end, clearly predates Snorri's writing by a considerable margin, echoed across multiple independent strands of the surviving poetic tradition he was drawing from. Winter itself, in this same mythological framework, had a face and a name, Sky, a giantess who married into the ranks of the Norse gods, and became closely associated with mountains, skiing, hunting, and the cold. Harsh landscape this culture actually lived inside every year. The prose Edda tells a wry, almost comic story about her marriage to the sea god Njunira, arranged as compensation after Sky's father was killed by the gods, the two of them agreeing to split their time between his home by the sea and hers up in the snowbound mountains, only to discover almost immediately that neither could stand the other's preferred environment for long, Njura complaining of the howling wolves that kept him awake in Sky's mountain hall, Sky complaining just as bitterly of the shrieking gulls that woke her by his shore. It reads honestly like a myth built at least partly for entertainment rather than pure religious solemnity. Two gods discovering, the hard way, that geography makes or breaks a marriage, but it also encodes something genuinely observed about this world. Winter and the sea, mountain cold and coastal mild, were understood as two fundamentally incompatible environments, each with its own god presiding over it, and neither one willing to simply adapt to the other's terms. Procopius wasn't alone in noticing something had gone badly wrong with the sky that year, and the breadth of independent witnesses is part of what makes the event so unusually well documented for something this ancient. Chinese court records from the same period describe summer frost and crop failure severe enough to trigger recorded famine, an ocean and a continent away from Constantinople. The Byzantine chronicler John of Ephesus, writing separately from Procopius, likewise described years of failed harvests and widespread hunger following close on the heels of the dimmed sun. None of these observers had any way of comparing notes with each other in real time, let alone with a farming settlement in central Sweden none of them had ever heard of. And yet modern tree ring and ice core evidence ties every one of their independent accounts back to the same narrow, catastrophic window, a rare case where written history from wildly different corners of the world and physical evidence pulled from ice and wood agree, almost eerily precisely, on both the timing and the scale of what happened. The specific image Norse myth eventually settled on for how this permanent winter would finally arrive: two wolves, Skill and Hati, who have chased the sun and moon across the sky since the beginning of the world, finally catching and devouring them both, carries its own particular chill once you sit with it. Distinct from the general cold of Fimbulwinter itself, it isn't simply darkness descending gradually, the way an ordinary Arctic winter tightens its grip week by week until the deepest solstice night. It's a hunt, finally successful after an eternity of pursuit, ending in the total and permanent loss of daylight itself as a fixed feature of the world rather than merely its temporary winter absence. Later medieval sources describing the run-up to Ragnarok pair that image with a second, equally unforgiving one, brother turning against brother, and the world's moral order collapsing right alongside its climate, as though this culture's mythology understood, on some level, that a cold severe enough and prolonged enough would eventually strain not just crops and livestock, but the bonds holding any community together in the first place. Winter darkness carried one more specific fear in this culture worth naming alongside Fimbulwinter and the Mara you already met sitting on sleepers' chests back in Aoun's hall. The Draugr, a restless, physically animated corpse believed capable of rising from its own burial mound to torment the living. Most often described in later Icelandic saga tradition as haunting isolated farms precisely during the darkest, most cut-off stretches of winter, when help was hardest to summon and daylight offered the least protection. One of the most vividly told examples survives in Grettis saga, describing a shepherd named Glimmer who dies alone in the mountains during a fierce winter storm and returns as a Draugr to terrorize the farm that once employed him, killing livestock and eventually people until the saga's hero, Grettir, confronts and finally destroys him in a prolonged nighttime struggle. It's worth flagging clearly, Grettis saga was written down in the 14th century, generations after the events it claims to describe, and like most saga material, it blends historical memory with dramatic embellishment in proportions no modern reader can fully untangle. But the underlying fear it dramatizes tracks with everything else this chapter has already shown you about the Norse relationship to winter darkness, isolation, cold, and the long night weren't simply uncomfortable in this worldview. They were understood as conditions under which the ordinary boundary between the living and the dead grew genuinely, dangerously thin. Skye's own story in the Prose Edda doesn't end with her mismatched marriage to Nirnir either, and its darker continuation ties Winter's goddess directly to one of Norse mythology's most brutal scenes of punishment. After the trickster god Loki is finally captured and bound by the other gods as punishment for his role in the death of the beloved god Balder, it's Skye. According to Snorri's account, who takes a particular hand in his suffering, placing a venomous serpent above his bound body so that its dripping poison will torment him continuously, in specific retribution for Loki's earlier role in her own father's death. It's a startling image to place alongside the wry, almost comic account of her failed marriage. The same goddess who couldn't stand the sound of gulls by the shore is also the myth's agent of prolonged, deliberate cruelty toward a bound and helpless prisoner. Taken together, the two stories paint winter, in this mythology, as something considerably more complicated than simple hardship to be endured, more complicated even than the slow, patient dread of Fimbulwinter itself. It's changeable, moody, capable of both petty domestic dissatisfaction and genuinely frightening sustained vengeance, which if you've spent any real time watching an Arctic sky shift from calm to violent in the space of an afternoon, might be the single most accurate thing this entire mythological system ever got right about the actual weather sitting just outside a longhouse door. Facing a force that mythology itself treated as potentially endless, this culture built one very deliberate, very practical countermeasure into its yearly calendar. Gel, the midwinter festival later generations would know as Yule, time to fall at or near the winter solstice, the year's single longest and darkest night, and observed with a blut, a ritual feast and sacrifice, offered to the gods in hopes of a mild spring and a good harvest to come. Archaeological evidence for large-scale feasting deposits, concentrations of animal bone consistent with sacrificial slaughter well beyond an ordinary household meal's needs, turns up at a number of Scandinavian sites in patterns consistent with exactly this kind of seasonal communal gathering. Archaeological evidence for large-scale feasting deposits, concentrations of animal bone consistent with sacrificial slaughter well beyond an ordinary household meal's needs, turns up at a number of Scandinavian sites in patterns consistent with exactly this kind of seasonal communal gathering. At Uppsala, in what's now southern Sweden, decades of excavation at a major settlement occupied continuously from the Iron Age through the Viking Age have recovered enormous quantities of animal bone, imported glass, and ritual objects concentrated around a distinct cult building at the site's centre, evidence that generations of archaeologists have read as testimony to exactly this pattern of periodic, large-scale communal feasting and sacrifice, sustained across centuries at a single significant location rather than improvised fresh each winter by every household independently. Not every Yule celebration reached that scale. Of course, most households, Oons included, would have marked the festival with whatever more modest feast their own stores that particular winter allowed. But sites like Uppsala confirm that the underlying instinct, when resources genuinely permitted it, ran toward exactly the kind of deliberate, defiant abundance you'd expect from a culture staring down a myth about winter that might, this time, simply decide not to end. Whatever its precise religious content, which almost certainly varied considerably by region and by era, Yule's basic function is easy enough to recognise even from this distance. Gather at the darkest, coldest, most frightening point of the entire year, eat and drink as well as the household stores could possibly allow, and turn a night that mythology itself imagined could simply refuse to end into. Instead, a deliberate communal celebration. When Christianity eventually took hold across Scandinavia in the centuries following the Viking Age, Yule's timing, and a fair amount of its practical shape, folded directly into the new religion's own midwinter celebration, rather than being replaced by it outright. Which is a large part of why an English speaker today still calls the 12 days following Christmas Yuletide. Carrying a Norse midwinter festival's name forward, mostly unnoticed, into a holiday built on top of it. There's a specific, more private kind of dread this same extended darkness could produce, distinct from any myth or festival, and it's worth naming honestly rather than romanticising away. In the northernmost reaches of the Norse world, well inside the Arctic Circle, midwinter doesn't just bring long nights, it brings weeks at a stretch with no true sunrise at all. The polar night. A stretch of near total darkness that modern researchers studying seasonal mood and light exposure have connected to real, measurable effects on human well-being, from disrupted sleep to a heavier, harder-to-shift low mood that modern medicine now has a specific name for. There's no way to know, from this distance, exactly how individual Norse communities living through that same darkness each year experienced or talked about it in psychological terms nobody in this century had a name for yet. But it would be dishonest to imagine the fear behind Fimbulwinter as purely abstract theology, disconnected from anything actually felt. Somewhere underneath the myth of a winter that swallows the sun for good, there was very likely also just the plain, private difficulty of getting through the year's darkest weeks with your own spirits intact. A struggle this culture never had the vocabulary to diagnose, but clearly, through Yule's deliberate light and warmth and company, understood well enough to build a yearly countermeasure against. Whether the genuine climate catastrophe of 536 directly seeded the specific myth of Fimbulwinter, whether it simply confirmed and sharpened an older, more general fear this culture already carried about the cold, or whether the two are connected only by coincidence and modern researchers' understandable desire to find a tidy explanation, remains a live and honestly unresolved question among the historians and archaeologists who study it. One more reminder, alongside the disputed authorship behind so much of the wider Norse legendary record, that even a well-evidenced physical catastrophe doesn't automatically hand a modern researcher the exact story a medieval audience told themselves about it. What isn't in question is the underlying honesty of the fear itself. A culture that measured its own survival every single year against a fire that had to be kept alive by hand through months of real and often genuinely dangerous cold had no need to invent an imaginary threat to take seriously. It had already lived close enough to the real one, Against a myth that dark, a culture needs more than a festival at the season's midpoint. It needs a way of marking, concretely, that the dark is actually loosening its grip, and Norse tradition built that reassurance into the calendar itself rather than leaving it to hope alone. Sumarmal, the beginning of summer, arriving by the Old Norse calendar in mid-April, functioned as its own recognised turning point, distinct from Yule's midwinter gathering, a moment communities could point to and say, with real calendrical authority behind them, that the year had officially tipped back toward light, regardless of how much snow still sat on the ground outside. It's a small thing, a name on a calendar, but it mattered precisely because Fimbulwinter's entire terror rested on the possibility that a normal winter's turning point simply wouldn't arrive one year, that spring, for once, would fail to answer when called. Having a fixed day to call it by, year after year, was its own quiet act of defiance against that fear, a culture insisting, out loud and on schedule, that the story it told itself about eventual light was more reliable than the story it told itself about eventual doom. Not every Norse household facing that same cold had a home valley's accumulated generations of hard-won knowledge to draw on. Either, some of them sailed west, past the edge of anything their grandparents would have recognised as familiar, and built a life from nothing on some of the harshest coastline the Norse world ever attempted to settle. A myth about a winter that refuses to end is a frightening thing to carry in the back of your mind on an ordinary night in Norway or Iceland, where spring, however late and however hard-won, has always eventually arrived. It's a considerably more immediate fear somewhere further out, on a coastline so marginal, so far from any of the accumulated generations of local knowledge this culture usually relied on, that a single genuinely bad winter could plausibly mean something closer to the myth's literal promise. The wind reaches you first, before you've even properly stepped off the boat, a hard, steady, unbroken push off open water with nothing between you and it for what feels like the whole width of the world, carrying a cold that has nothing gentle about it at all. This is Greenland, a coastline settled by Norse colonists beginning around 985 AD under a leader named Eric the Red, who according to later saga tradition gave the place its deliberately optimistic name specifically to lure other settlers into following him, a piece of what you might call the world's earliest recorded real estate marketing. Considering how little of this landscape actually lives up to the word green. You've arrived at one of the settlement's farms in early autumn, the grass still holding a last stubborn green in the low valleys, and you have, by every account you've been given, a matter of weeks before the work that actually determines whether this household survives, the coming winter needs to be finished. That work begins with a decision that sounds almost cruel stated plainly. Not every animal this farm currently owns is going to see spring, and the household needs to decide, deliberately and in advance, which ones. Hay cut and dried through the short Greenland summer-only stretches so far, and a herd sized for summer grazing is, by simple arithmetic, too large for winter feed stores to support. So the autumn slaughter happens, a period of concentrated, unglamorous labour in which a portion of the herd is culled, the meat dried, smoked where fuel allows, or simply relied on to freeze solid in Greenland's reliably brutal cold rather than preserved by salt. A resource this colony had to import at real expense and use sparingly rather than take for granted the way a coastal Norwegian household might. It's not a comfortable process to witness, and nobody here pretends otherwise. But the alternative, trying to feed every animal through a winter the hay simply can't support, risks losing the entire herd to starvation instead of a calculated portion of it, and every farmer on this coastline has done this math too many times to flinch from it now. By the time the culling and drying is finished, the household turns to the same turf and timber construction you've already seen work so well further south, adapted here to a landscape with even less to spare. Driftwood, carried across the open ocean by currents from as far away as Siberia and washed up along Greenland's shores in unpredictable quantities, functions as this colony's single most valuable and least reliable timber source, supplemented by whatever could be shipped in at real cost from Norway or Iceland when trade ships actually made the crossing. Where wood genuinely runs short, This household, like others along this same coast, has learned to build with what the sea itself provides in abundance: whalebone and walrus ivory worked into roof supports and structural elements where timber can't stretch far enough to cover it. A substitution that would have seemed unthinkable to a Norwegian carpenter working with an actual forest at his back. And that tells you, more clearly than almost anything else on this coastline, just how far this particular branch of Norse settlement had to bend its own inherited building tradition to survive somewhere this unforgiving. The farm hosting you this winter sits a reasonable distance from Brattle, the settlement Eric the Red established as his own home, and in effect, the colony's founding farm. A site modern archaeologists have excavated extensively, uncovering the footprint of a substantial turf and timber hall, along with, tellingly, one of the earliest Christian churches built anywhere in the Norse Greenland colony, evidence of a religious shift that reportedly divided Eric's own household, his wife Gilda converting to Christianity well before he did. According to saga tradition that should, as always, be weighed as literary memory rather than a contemporaneous record. What the excavated ruins confirm, regardless of any saga's embellishment, is scale. Brattle supported a genuinely substantial household, buyers for a real herd of cattle despite the marginal grazing this coastline offers, and building techniques recognisably continuous, with everything you've already seen further south in Iceland and Norway, stretched here to their absolute practical limit, against a landscape offering considerably less forgiveness for any mistake in the design. You get an unexpectedly vivid sense of exactly what this colony's people actually wore against that cold, from a source that has nothing to do with any saga at all. At Herjolfsnes, another Norse Greenland settlement further south along this same coast, a churchyard cemetery preserved by the region's permafrost yielded, when excavated in the early 20th century, an extraordinary collection of actual medieval garments, hooded gowns, tunics and caps, buried with the dead and preserved by ground conditions that almost never allowed cloth this old to survive intact anywhere else in the Norse world. The garments themselves show clear influence from broader European fashion of their period, cut and styled in ways recognisably related to clothing worn across contemporary Norway and further south, evidence that this remote, ice-bound colony never fully lost touch with the wider cultural world it had sailed away from, adapting continental fashion to a climate considerably harsher than anywhere it had originally been designed for. Looking at a reconstruction of one of those Herjolfsnes gowns, heavy wool, generously cut, clearly built for real warmth over elegance, you understand something about this household's own clothing chest a little differently. Every layer in it represents not just practical necessity, but a stubborn, ongoing insistence on staying connected, through fabric and cut and style, to a wider Norse world most of this colony's people would go their entire lives without seeing again in person. By your second week on the farm, you've been introduced to a broad-shouldered young hunter named Halder, whose winter work matters to this household in a way that goes well beyond ordinary farm labour. Once the sea ice sets firm enough to bear weight, a threshold he judges by eye and long practice rather than any instrument, testing thickness at the shore's edge before venturing further out, Halder spends long stretches of the darkest months out on that ice, hunting seal at their breathing holes with a patience that borders on the meditative. A single motionless watch, sometimes lasting hours for one clean strike when a seal finally surfaces. To breathe. Seal meat, seal blubber rendered for both food and fuel, and seal hide for clothing and rope together make up a genuinely substantial share of this colony's winter survival, filling a gap that livestock and dried hay alone could never close on a coastline this far north. It's dangerous, solitary work, ice that seems solid can fail without warning, and a hunter caught in open, frigid water far from shore has only minutes, not hours, before the cold itself becomes the more immediate threat than drowning. Halder goes out anyway, most days the weather allows it, because the alternative is a household with considerably less food than it needs by February. Diet on this farm, across the whole of the winter, turns out to be a considerably more varied balancing act than you first assumed, stitched together from every source this harsh coastline grudgingly offers. Skyr, the same tangy, strained dairy staple you'd have found in any Icelandic household's dairy, gets made here too, wherever the herd's reduced winter milk yield allows it, stretched carefully across the household's meals rather than eaten freely. Dried fish, stockfish, wind-dried rather than salted, hung and cured during the brief window good weather allows, supplements the seal meat Halder brings in, and during the short Greenland summer just past, a portion of the household had travelled inland to hunt caribou. Another source of meat and hide now folded into this winter's stores alongside everything the sea has provided. No single source, on its own, would carry this household through to spring. It's the accumulation of all of them together, dairy, dried fish, seal, caribou, the culled portion of the herd, that adds up to something resembling real security. The same layered, redundant logic that put 2 furs on Ra's bench rather than trusting 1 blanket alone to do the whole job. Halder doesn't come back from the ice one evening at his usual hour, and you watch the farm's mood shift, quickly and without anyone needing to say why out loud, from ordinary evening routine into something tighter and more watchful. He arrives a little over an hour later than expected, soaked through 1 leg to the hip and shivering hard enough that his teeth audibly chatter as he ducks through the door. The ice had given way beneath him closer to a breathing hole than he'd judged, plunging him into water cold enough to steal a person's coordinated strength within minutes. And he'd hauled himself back out only through a combination of raw luck and the kind of practiced, unpanicked technique this coastline's hunters clearly drill into themselves, precisely because the alternative doesn't leave room for a second attempt. The household moves around him with immediate, wordless efficiency, wet clothes stripped and replaced with dry wool pulled straight from the driest chest in the hall, his body packed close between 2 others on the bench nearest the fire, someone pressing a warmed stone, the very same low-tech trick you watched, slipped under Ra's blanket back in Norway, directly against his chest. He's shivering less within the hour, properly warm again by full dark, and by the next morning he's back on his feet, quieter than usual, but otherwise himself. Nobody treats it as a dramatic story worth retelling at length. It's simply what happens, often enough on this coastline, to be met with a response this well-practiced rather than panic. 1 more piece of hard-won household knowledge. Alongside the culling math and the driftwood carpentry that this whole colony had to learn from scratch, out here, with no accumulated generations of local experience to borrow from when they first arrived. By midwinter, the isolation Owen's household back in Norway experiences as an occasional, notable hardship becomes, on this coastline, close to total and unbroken. The last trade ship of the season, weather permitting, departed weeks or months earlier, carrying news, letters, and whatever this farm had to sell back toward Iceland and Norway, and no new ship, no new word from anywhere beyond this settlement's own small cluster of farms, will arrive again until the ice breaks and the sailing season resumes, months from now. You find yourself thinking, more than once, about everything that could happen in that gap, births, deaths, entire political upheavals back in the homelands these settlers still call home, utterly unknown to this farm until spring finally, eventually, carries the news across. There's a particular quality to the silence this produces that you notice most clearly at night, lying on a bench not unlike the one you slept on further south, listening for a sound that simply isn't there. No distant hint of another farm's activity carrying on the wind. No likelihood of an unexpected traveller's knock, the way Owen's household took for granted on an ordinary cold night. Just this one farm, this one household, entirely responsible for itself until a season neither hurries nor negotiates, finally decides to turn. It's a form of isolation this culture had genuinely refined coping mechanisms for. The same communal density and shared bench warmth you've already seen practiced further south, but stretched here across a longer, lonelier season, with considerably less margin if anything goes seriously wrong. What makes this particular hardship worth enduring, from a purely economic standpoint, becomes clear the first time you handle one of the household's most valuable stored goods. A long, spiraled ivory tusk, pale and heavy, taken from a narwhal hunted or traded from further north along the coast. Walrus ivory and narwhal tusk together formed one of medieval Norse Greenland's most valuable exports, shipped back to Norway and from there into wider European trade networks, where a narwhal tusk, its true origin often deliberately obscured or simply unknown to the buyer, could be sold at extraordinary prices as a genuine unicorn's horn, prized in royal courts and cathedral treasuries across medieval Europe as a substance believed capable of detecting poison. It's a strange, almost absurd detail to sit with, out here on an actual ice-locked coastline, where the tusk in question came from an entirely ordinary, if remarkable, Arctic sea mammal. This colony's entire economic viability, its ability to buy the timber and grain and iron it couldn't produce itself, rested in real part on wealthy Europeans thousands of miles away believing, sincerely, that they were purchasing proof of a magical unicorn. You're not the only visitors this coastline sees, either, though contact with the other people who call this land home happens on terms this Norse settlement never fully controlled. The Norse settlers' own writings and later saga tradition refer to encounters with a people they called Skurlingar, almost certainly ancestors of the Thule Inuit, whose own migration into the region from further north and west overlapped with the Norse presence for generations, describing episodes of both cautious trade and, at other points, open conflict, though the surviving Norse-authored sources naturally tell only one side of that long, complicated relationship, and no Norse account bothers to record how the Thule themselves understood these same encounters. What the archaeological record adds, where Norse and Thule Inuit sites sit close enough together to compare directly, is evidence of at least some genuine exchange of goods across this cultural boundary, a detail easy to miss if you only read the more dramatic conflict passages saga tradition tends to emphasize, and worth remembering as you watch Holder check, out of old habit, for any trace of unfamiliar tracks near his own hunting grounds this season. What holds a scattering of isolated farms like this one together, across a coastline where the nearest neighbour might be a genuine day's hard travel away, turns out to be less about proximity than about a shared calendar of gathering points, chief among them the church. By the time this particular winter finds you here, Norse Greenland supports something close to a proper ecclesiastical structure of its own, a network of parish churches scattered across the eastern and western settlements, and at Garrar, a seat substantial enough to host a resident bishop, complete with what excavation has confirmed was a genuinely large cathedral building and an even larger adjoining barn, evidence of a farm wealthy enough in livestock to support the colony's most senior churchmen in real comfort by this coastline's own standards. It's easy to picture Norse Greenland as nothing but scattered, isolated farms fighting the cold alone, and for long stretches of any given winter, that's not far from the truth. But feast days, baptisms, the deliberate rhythm of a shared religious calendar pulled these same isolated households together often enough across the wider colony's short travel season to keep this from ever being a purely solitary existence. One more layer, alongside the culled herd and the dried seal meat and the imported wool, that this community built specifically to survive a landscape that offered almost nothing for free. The dark itself, this far north, becomes its own kind of test long before any single crisis like Holder's ice water plunge ever does. At this latitude, midwinter days shrink to only a handful of usable daylight hours, and the household's evenings stretch correspondingly long, hour after hour by lamplight with genuinely limited work left to fill them once the day's essential chores are done. What fills that stretch, more often than not, is talk. News carried by the last ship of the season turned over and re-examined for the 10th time. Half-remembered verses recited by whoever in the household has a memory for them. And stories, some clearly familiar to everyone present and requested anyway. The way a well-loved tale gets requested precisely because its ending is already known and comforting, rather than in spite of it. Skaldic verse, the dense, formally structured poetry this whole Norse cultural world prized and rewarded handsomely, when performed well at a chieftain's hall, doesn't require a chieftain's hall to matter on a night like this one, a simpler, plainer version of the same storytelling instinct, does real work here too, holding a small, isolated household together through hours that could otherwise stretch towards something closer to despair. You watch the household's eldest tell a story you suspect everyone present has heard a dozen times before. Watch faces settle rather than tense as the familiar beats arrive on schedule, and understand, finally, that this too is a form of insulation, every bit as deliberate as turf walls or a banked fire, a defence built not against the physical cold, but against the particular loneliness of a dark this long, on a coastline this far from anywhere else. Not every winter on this coastline goes as well as this one seems to be going so far, and the household, having lived through enough of them by now to know better than false confidence, doesn't pretend otherwise. This colony, the eastern and western settlements together, spread thin across a genuinely marginal stretch of habitable coastline, will, centuries from now, disappear from the historical record entirely, its last confirmed written trace a wedding recorded at a church here in the early 15th century, with no clear single account of what finally happened to the people who remained after that. Whether it was worsening cold as a broader climatic shift historians call the Little Ice Age tightened its grip on this already marginal coastline, or the isolation you're feeling so acutely this very winter finally growing too costly to sustain, or conflict, or some combination none of the surviving evidence fully untangles, is a question this chapter doesn't have room to answer yet. Tonight, though, in this specific winter, with Haldar's seal catch drying by the fire, his shivering long since stopped and his colour fully back, and the last ship's news still fresh enough to talk over at the bench nearest the fire, none of that harder ending lies ahead of anyone in this hall. It's still, for now, simply a hard, remote, resourceful life, lived by people who built a version of home on some of the least forgiving coastline the Norse world ever dared to settle, and, for this one particular winter at least, made it work. The same way Aoun's household made it work. The same way Sting's household made it work right up until the mountain above their valley decided otherwise. Haldar's farm made it through, this particular year, on skill, hard arithmetic, patience learned the hard way out on the ice, and a household's accumulated willingness to adapt an inherited building tradition until it worked somewhere it was never originally designed for. Whether every household on that coastline kept making it through across the centuries that followed is a question nobody alive at the time could have answered, and it's a question modern archaeology has only been able to properly investigate by doing something almost nobody in this story ever got to do themselves, going back, centuries later, and actually testing whether any of it really worked the way it was supposed to. In 1983, on the island of Vestgi in Norway's Lofoten archipelago, well north of the Arctic Circle, a farmer ploughing a field turned up something that sent archaeologists scrambling. Postholes and foundation traces suggesting a building far larger than any ordinary Viking Age farmhouse had any business being. Excavations that followed over the next several years, led by a team that included the archaeologist Gerd Stams Munch, gradually revealed the full outline of a long house measuring some 83 metres end to end, among the largest Viking Age buildings ever confirmed anywhere in the Norse world, with occupation phases stretching back centuries earlier and continuing right through the Viking Age itself. This wasn't an ordinary farmer's hall. The scale, along with high-status objects recovered from the site, pointed to a chieftain's residence, a seat of real regional power perched at the very edge of the habitable Norse world, close enough to the Arctic Circle that its winters would have made even Aoun's hall, further south, look almost temperate by comparison. Rather than leave that discovery as a set of postholes on an interpretive sign, the Norwegian team behind what's now called the Lofoten Viking Museum made a decision considerably more ambitious. They rebuilt it, at full scale on the original footprint, using the excavation's precise measurements as their blueprint rather than artistic guesswork, opening the reconstruction to the public in 1995. Walking through the finished hall today means walking through a structure genuinely 83 metres long, its own central long fire running much of that length, its own roof rising to a peak pierced by its own version of the small jury smoke hole you've already spent a night sleeping beneath. It's the same basic system Aoun tends every night in a hall a fraction of this size, scaled up to house not one extended family, but an entire chieftain's household, retinue and guests, proof that this whole design language, refined generation by generation across ordinary farms, scaled successfully all the way up to genuine political power as well. Lofoten and Gevaldesbrinn aren't the only places this same instinct has taken hold, either at Trelleborg in Denmark. One of a network of remarkably precise circular fortresses built under King Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century, excavation revealed the foundations of longhouses arranged with an almost military regularity inside the fortress's ringed earthworks, and a full-scale reconstruction built there decades ago lets visitors walk through the same long fire, turf and timber system yet again. This time inside a structure built not by an ordinary farming household, but by a centralized royal authority organizing labour and building standards across an entire kingdom. Seeing the same basic architectural language repeated at Trelleborg's fortress, at Lofoten's chieftain's hall, at Sting's ordinary Icelandic farm, and in the turf walls of Aoun's own modest household, makes something clear that no single site could demonstrate on its own. This wasn't a regional quirk or a single clever family's private trick. It was a shared, culture-wide engineering standard, understood and applied with only minor local variation from a Danish king's fortress to the humblest farm on Iceland's coldest coast. What makes a reconstruction like Lofoten's worth more than simple tourism, though, is what it allowed researchers to actually measure rather than merely imagine. Staff and visiting archaeologists have lit real fires in that real long fire trench, in that real turf and timber hall, and tracked, with instruments no Viking Age household ever had access to, exactly how the building performs, how quickly the air near the benches warms once the fire catches, how completely the jury clears smoke from head height even in a room this large, how long the turf walls hold residual heat once the fires burn down for the night. The results consistently confirm what this whole story has already shown you, lived rather than measured. Through 5 long chapters, that a design with no chimney, no glass and walls made of stacked earth wasn't a primitive compromise forced on people who knew no better. It was a genuinely effective piece of engineering, refined by trial and error across centuries, that modern instruments can now quantify, but that ordinary Norse households like Aoun's had already proven the hard way. Every single winter, long before anyone thought to measure it. Iceland's own version of this same instinct predates Lofoten's reconstruction by 2 decades. Gevaldesbrinn, the full-scale rebuild of Stingy's longhouse you already learnt about, built in the 1970s directly from that farm's ash-preserved excavation data, stands as the earlier proof of the same underlying idea, that the most reliable way to understand whether a piece of 1,000-year-old engineering genuinely worked isn't to read about it, but to rebuild it, light its fire, and find out. Between Gevaldesbrinn's ash-sealed blueprint and Lofoten's excavated chieftain's hall, modern Norse archaeology has managed something unusually rare for any pre-modern building tradition, not just a description of how these halls were built, but a working, testable, repeatedly confirmed answer for how they actually performed. Nowhere does that spirit of go and check it yourself archaeology matter more than on a windswept stretch of Newfoundland coastline that, for centuries, nobody outside a small circle of saga scholars took entirely seriously as a real place at all. Icelandic sagas, chiefly the saga of the Greenlanders and Eirik the Red saga, both written down centuries after the events they describe, recount voyages west from Greenland to a land the sagas call Vinland, rich enough in wild grapes or berries to earn that name, explored and briefly settled by a small Norse expedition around the turn of the 11th century. For generations, this was treated by most scholars as attractive but unverifiable legend, the same category of source that requires the same caution you've already learned to apply to any claim tracing back to embellished saga material. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Steiningstad, acting on a tip from a local resident, identified a set of low grass-covered mounds at a place called Lyons Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland that turned out on excavation between 1961 and 1968 to be the genuine foundations of Norse turf buildings, the first, and to date the only, confirmed Norse site anywhere in North America outside of Greenland itself. What the Ingstads and later archaeologists uncovered at Lance Orks Meadows was considerably smaller and more purpose-built than either Sting's refined farmhouse or Lofota's chieftain's hall. A cluster of turf-walled structures, including what excavators identified as a working smithy, complete with evidence of iron smelted from local bog ore and worked into ship's nails and rivets, alongside boat repair sheds and simple sleeping halls sized for an expedition's crew rather than a settled farming household's generations. Nothing about the site suggests permanent, long-term settlement on the scale of Iceland or even Greenland. The evidence points instead toward a base camp, likely used for a handful of years by successive small expeditions launching further exploration south along the coast, a reading reinforced by the discovery of butternuts and butternut wood at the site, a species that doesn't grow anywhere near Newfoundland itself, and that could only have been carried back from expeditions reaching considerably further south into territory that better matches the Sargas's own descriptions of Vinland's milder Great Bearing landscape. Dating exactly when this brief, remarkable outpost was occupied became possible only very recently, through a genuinely elegant piece of scientific detective work. A 2021 study published in the journal Nature, led by researcher Margot Quittams and colleagues, examined wood recovered from the site bearing clear metal tool-cut marks. Proof it had been felled by Norse hands rather than any natural process, and identified within its tree rings a distinctive chemical signature corresponding to a known cosmic ray event. A brief spike in atmospheric radiocarbon caused by a burst of solar radiation that left a fingerprint in trees growing anywhere on Earth in the year 993 AD. By counting the tree rings outward from that fixed, globally verified marker to the bark's outermost edge, a technique that works precisely because the 993 spike shows up simultaneously in trees anywhere on the planet, giving researchers a shared, unambiguous 0 point no matter where a given sample happens to come from. The research team pinned the felling of this particular timber to precisely the year 1021 AD, not an estimated range spanning decades, as most archaeological dating requires, but a single, confirmed calendar year, making it among the most precisely dated pieces of evidence for any event anywhere in the Viking Age. It's a remarkable confirmation, arriving a full millennium later, that the Sargas outline of a westward voyage, however embellished in its retelling across the intervening centuries, was describing something genuinely real. That smithy at Lonsors Meadows deserves a closer look on its own, because it tells you something about this expedition's intentions that the Sargas' more dramatic passages tend to skip past entirely. Producing iron from bog ore, a laborious, technically demanding process requiring sustained high heat and real metallurgical skill, not something an exploring party would bother setting up for a single brief stopover, indicates a level of infrastructure investment consistent with a base intended for repeated use across multiple seasons, a working outpost rather than a one-time landing. The iron produced there went, as far as excavators can tell from the nails and rivets recovered, primarily towards ship maintenance, a fleet this far from any home port, with no possibility of simply sailing back to Norway for replacement fittings, needed the capacity to repair itself on site, and Lolensors Meadows' smithy is the physical proof that this expedition planned, at minimum, to be self-sufficient for considerably longer than a single summer's exploration would have required. Walk through Lofota's reconstructed hall today, on any given summer afternoon, and you'll likely find costumed museum staff tending that same 83-metre-long fire for visitors rather than for a chieftain's household, demonstrating exactly the kind of coal banking, wood rationing. Smoke managing skill Ewun practices every single night purely as a matter of survival. It's a strange kind of inheritance, watching a modern employee in reconstructed Viking-age dress rake ash over glowing coals as a scheduled demonstration rather than a genuine nightly necessity. The same motion, the same accumulated practical wisdom. performed now for education and curiosity rather than because a household's actual survival depends on getting it right. But the fire still works exactly the way it worked 1,000 years ago, still clears smoke up and out through the same small roof opening, still holds its heat in the same metre-thick turf walls, regardless of whether the person tending it tonight goes home afterward to central heating or, like Aoun, has nowhere else warmer to go at all. Norse Greenland's own ending, the one this story left unresolved back on Halder's farm, has its clearest modern answers from a similar combination of patient excavation and increasingly precise scientific technique. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains recovered from Greenland's Norse-era churchyards, including at Herjolfsnes, where those remarkable preserved garments were found, allows researchers to reconstruct shifts in diet across the colony's several centuries of occupation, tracking a population that appears, in its later generations, to have relied increasingly on marine resources, seal in particular, as land-based farming grew more marginal. Ice cores and other regional climate proxies confirm that a genuine cooling trend, part of the broader climatic shift historians call the Little Ice Age, tightened its grip across the North Atlantic beginning around the 13th century, shortening growing seasons and almost certainly increasing the frequency of exactly the kind of hard, unforgiving winters this coastline's farms had always operated closest to the edge of surviving. No single explanation fully satisfies every researcher who studied this question. Isolation from European trade networks, worsening climate, soil exhaustion from centuries of grazing, and possibly conflict or voluntary emigration back toward Iceland and Norway have all been proposed as contributing factors. And the genuine, current scholarly position is that several of these pressures very likely compounded together rather than any single cause acting alone. What the evidence does confirm clearly is that the ending wasn't sudden. It was gradual, generational, a slow tightening of margins that had never been generous to begin with, playing out across decades rather than arriving as any single dramatic catastrophe. The very last written trace of that colony's presence, fittingly enough, comes not from any Norwegian or Icelandic annal, but from the colony's own soil, a document recording a wedding held at Felsey Church, on Greenland's southern coast, in September of 1408, a marriage between two named Norse Greenlanders, witnessed and later carried back to Iceland by ship, the last confirmed. Dated piece of documentary evidence that anyone was still living in this settlement at all. Hvalsey's stone church itself, unlike most of the colony's turf-built farmhouses, survives today as the best preserved Norse ruin anywhere in Greenland, its walls still standing to roughly their original height on a quiet stretch of fjord-side grass. A building that has now stood empty considerably longer than it ever stood full. Nobody recorded what happened to the colony in the decades immediately following that wedding. There's no final annal entry, no last letter home, no dramatic account of an ending at all, only a slow fade into archaeological silence. The newlyweds' own fate as unknown to us now as everything else about the community's final years, swallowed by the same patient, unglamorous erosion of margin that this entire chapter has spent so long trying to reconstruct from ice cores isotopes. And abandoned fields. That confirmed effectiveness has started to matter for reasons that have nothing to do with historical curiosity at all. In recent years, architects and building researchers interested in low-carbon, naturally insulated construction have begun looking seriously at turf and earth wall building techniques, not as museum curiosities, but as genuine models worth adapting for modern low-energy housing, particularly in colder climates where conventional insulation carries a real manufacturing and transport carbon cost that a wall built from cut, stacked, locally sourced earth simply doesn't. It's a strange kind of vindication for a building method that spent centuries being treated, in popular imagination, as a primitive stopgap forced on people too poor or too remote to build in stone or brick. The same metre-thick turf wall that kept Aoun warm without a single watt of electricity, it turns out, solves a genuinely current problem for architects thinking hard about how to heat a home without heating the planet along with it. Proof that good engineering, once it's actually been tested and measured rather than merely assumed, doesn't really expire just because the century around it moved on. Even the exact year of that Newfoundland expedition, once impossible to pin down more precisely than a rough range of decades, has recently come into sharper focus through a genuinely remarkable piece of scientific detective work. A 2021 study led by researcher Margot Quitums examined wood recovered from Lansource Meadows and identified, within its growth rings, a distinctive spike in radiocarbon concentration, known to correspond to a specific well-documented solar storm that struck Earth in 993 AD, an event energetic enough to leave a detectable signature in trees worldwide that year. By counting outward, ring by careful ring, from that one identifiable growth line to the tree's outermost surviving layer, the bark edge, marking the exact final year the tree was felled and never grew another season after, researchers were able to date the timber's cutting to precisely 1021 AD, giving this Norse voyage to North America the distinction of being pinned to an exact calendar year, with a level of precision almost no other event from this entire period of history, Viking or otherwise, can genuinely claim. It's a strange kind of poetry, if you sit with it. A solar storm nearly 1,000 years in the past, etched invisibly into a tree's own growth, waiting patiently to tell 21st century scientists exactly when a small group of Norse voyagers once stood on this shore. A very long way from any turf-walled hall they might have called home. This is the story of a building type that outlived nearly everyone who ever depended on it, in the end rediscovered not because anyone deliberately preserved it for the future, but because ash at Sting, permafrost and low-traffic isolation at Lansource Meadows, and simple abandonment across Giserdala and the Greenland coast all happened, independently and by accident, to protect the evidence long enough for later curiosity to finally catch up with it. There's a particular kind of wonder worth sitting with at the end of all this rediscovery that has nothing to do with any single artifact or measurement. Every piece of evidence this chapter has walked through, Lofota's measured airflow, Sting's ash-sealed floor plan, Lansource Meadows' single precisely dated timber, Herjolfsn's preserved wool gowns, a stone church at Fulsey still standing empty over a fjord 6 centuries after its last recorded wedding, exists only because something about these people's ordinary lives got interrupted, abandoned, or buried before it could simply wear away the way most of history does. Nobody at Sting packed their spindle halls carefully for future archaeologists to find. Nobody at Lansource Meadows felled that particular timber knowing a cosmic ray event would one day let scientists 1,000 years later read its exact felling date out of its rings. They were only ever trying to get through one more winter, the same as Oun, the same as Halder, the same as every household this whole story has followed through the dark. That they succeeded, reliably, for centuries, against a climate that offered them almost nothing for free, turns out to be the actual discovery hiding inside every one of these excavations. Not that Viking Age people were remarkable for surviving the cold, but that they made surviving it look, from the inside of a well-tended longhouse on an ordinary night, almost unremarkable. Which, if you've been paying attention since that very first night ducking through a low-turf doorway into wood smoke and wet wool, and one young man's quiet, practised watch over a bed of coals, might be the highest compliment any piece of engineering can ever actually earn, that the people living inside it, most nights, barely had to think about it working at all. Somewhere back at the very start of tonight, before Aoun, before Sting, before a mountain buried one valley and an ocean isolated another, you were told something simple. You're warm right now, and that wouldn't be true where this story was taking you. It wasn't, for a while. You felt the wind off a Norwegian fjord and the deeper cold of an Icelandic midnight, and the particular, bone-deep chill of open water closing over a hunter's leg on the Greenland ice. And every single time, someone, Aoun raking coals under ash, a Frasier tucking a warm stone under a child's blanket, a household pulling a half-frozen fisherman back from a Greenland ice hole, found a way to close that gap between cold and warm, using nothing but turf, fire, wool, and each other. That's the whole story, really, however many volcanoes or armies or myths get folded around its edges. Not survival as some dramatic singular triumph, but survival as a habit, practiced nightly, by people who rarely got thanked for getting it right, and never once let that stop them from doing it again the next evening. Owoon's fire is still burning, somewhere in the account you've just heard, banked low, patient, waiting under its blanket of ash, for a hand that already knows exactly how to wake it again by morning. You don't have to tend a fire like that tonight. Somewhere between then and now, the work got easier, the walls got thinner, the danger got smaller, but the warmth is the same warmth however it reaches you. You're warm. You're safe. And whatever waited outside their turf walls 1,000 winters ago, tonight it isn't waiting for you.